Enoch noticed the world had a speaking quality the moment he first looked up before dawn, when the horizon was a bruise of blue and a fever of gold. The air itself seemed to hold sentences, a hush before punctuation, as if some vast mouth were preparing to tell him something essential. He had been a quiet man until then, a surveyor of beasts and fields and family, but that morning the house felt like the wrong size for the knowledge pressing against his ribs. He understood instinctively that something old and careful was about to address him, and that he must be ready to listen in a way he had never tried before. When Enoch looked up and felt the world begin to speak, it was like the universe was whispering to anyone willing to listen. Subscribe and tell us in the comments if you've ever felt that same pull, that moment when the world seems to talk just to you. He went alone to the ridge under the sentinel pines because solitude was the only place he trusted to hear speech that was not human. The pines breathed like a chorus, needles whispering along the trunk in tiny, bright syllables that the dawn translated into feeling rather than words. Enoch closed his eyes and let the light come into him first as warmth, then as rhythm, until each blade of sunlight could be felt like a finger tracing patterns on his skin. The watcher stood there, not as a figure in a robe or a shadow in the corner, but as something that altered how the light behaved, bending morning into meaning. When the watcher spoke, the language was not made of vowels and consonants but of inflection and beams and the cadence of reflections. It murmured in gradients, a soft incline of amber meant caution, a sharp, silver flash meant revelation, a slow-spreading blue meant patience. Enoch felt the grammar more than heard it, as if his ribs were a bell tuned to the right pitch and the light struck it with a finger. Words came as patterns in the sky, lines of luminescence that unfurled and braided like ribbons, and the watcher guided his gaze to their joins and seams. The first lesson was the naming of edges, the edge where shadow and light meet, the thin scallop where darkness retires and day advances. The watcher traced those edges with a luminous stylus and explained that each one held a kind of grammar, a way the world stitched itself together. Enoch learned to read the curve where a shadow sighed away from a stone, to see in that curve an old kindness, a memory of rain in the rock. He began to gather these edges like shells on a shore, and though they were common things, they felt as though they could tell the story of everything. Light taught him the concept of voice by how it moved across surfaces. A table reflected the sun's honesty straight and unembellished, while water allowed the same light to scatter into secrets. The watcher showed him how light could be honest or deceitful, how it could hide or reveal, and how it made promises with its angles. Enoch watched the room change personality with the sun's path and noted how people in the house chose to place themselves in certain lights as if in conversation with the day. Later, the watcher moved through the hours and introduced the sun as a teacher and the moon as an archivist. The sun spoke in direct, expanding sentences, warm and instantaneous, while the moon loved slow elliptical clauses, parentheses of silver that stored the night's subtleations. The watcher let Enoch stand on a ridge where both were visible, the sun declining like a great secret being given, the moon rising as if to catch each phrase and tuck it away. Enoch felt the difference in his chest, as though one part of him wanted to run forward with the sun and another wanted to linger and catalogue with the moon. Daylight taught him the syntax of growth. The sun's light tended to insist on clarity and proclamation, pushing the world toward completion and making colors speak loudly. Under that regime, sprouts declared themselves, faces opened, rivers glowed like freshly minted coins. The language of the sun was the language of manifest things. To listen to it was to know the current chapter of becoming. Night taught him the semantics of reflection. Moonlight softened verbs into memories and made time seem circular instead of linear. Under silver, impressions deepened into meanings, and the mistakes of the day could be revised like a scribe rubbing out a line and rewriting it with better understanding. The moon gave Enoch the patience to interpret what the sun had said, revealing layers he had missed when dazzled by noon. The watcher explained that light bore history in its quality. A river that had once been wide would bear a certain bruised light, and a mountain that had been struck by lightning would catch the sun in a particular way forever after. Enoch learned to approach places not just as locations, but as pages that held the residue of events, and he learned that the light read them aloud to anyone who knew how to listen. He began to understand why old men whose eyes were clouded still carried memories like lamplight. Those memories were imprinted in the ways the light touched their world. He was taught to name colors not by crude words, but by their conversation with time and weather. A green could be an accusation, a relief, a hunger. A blue could be a flat silence or a hollow in the sky that had been carved by years of wind. The watcher drew comparisons. A certain dusk held the memory of famine, an early summer light kept the echo of laughter that once spilled from a village. Each chroma was a verb tense in mood, and Enoch's senses stretched to hold them. Enoch's voice changed as he learned to speak back to the light. At first it was a small syntax, a soft returning note to the sun's declarations or the moon's asides. He would move his hand to shade a child's eyes and notice how the shadow answered, how the child's face rearranged itself in the quieter grammar of shade. The watcher encouraged him to practice, to experiment with subtle changes until the light's replies became predictable, and then, with patience, persuasive. The watcher showed him the struggle of complement, how light and shadow are not enemies but dialogue partners that shape meaning by opposition. A blade of light dividing a dark room was less a triumph than a colloquy, each side framing the other and defining sense. Enoch learned that to change the tone of a place he did not need to banish the dark but to craft edges and angles that would cause light and shadow to speak differently. That was the first true lesson in the moral dimension of illumination, how to arrange the world so that ugliness might bend toward mercy without pretending to deny its existence. Days turned into months as Enoch's apprenticeship deepened, and the watcher offered him stories of celestial ordinances, the rules by which bodies of light moved and returned. The sun keeps a certain fidelity to movement because it is committed to giving. The moon adjusts its voice because it is accountable to tides and the whispers of other bodies. These were not dry principles but ethical gestures, ways that light behaved according to promises written before his time. Enoch began to see those promises mirrored in small human oaths and in the predictable kindnesses of weather. The watcher taught him about proportion, not only the size of a light's beam but its balance against the world it inhabits. A tiny lamp in a great hall can speak with more intimacy than a blaze meant to be seen from miles away, and a distant star keeps its dignity by being small. He understood that scale in the language of light was also a social grammar. The sun's proclamation needed humility to be humane, and the moon's archive needed clarity so its revisions could be understood. Enoch tried to practice proportion in his own words and deeds, noticing how humility could change a family's argument into a conversation and how measured brightness could calm a frightened village. He learned to hear light's contradictions. The same sun that ripened a field could scorch a child's skin if untempered, and the same moon that revealed a path could exaggerate shadows into ghosts. The watcher showed him that this was not hypocrisy but the natural ambivalence of power. Language, in all its brilliance and cruelty, contained both gift and cost, and Enoch had to learn to negotiate that tension in the lives he touched. Sometimes the revelation came in whispers during storms when lightning carved the heavens like a punctuation mark and thunder read the line aloud. In those moments, the watcher guided Enoch's attention to fleeting syllables that only the brave could catch. Lightning taught him about immediate truth, how singular illuminations could expose what had been hidden, while thunder taught him about consequence, the way revelation arrives with aftershocks. Enoch learned to respect sudden insights and to wait for the consequences to be heard. He was taught subtler exercises, like the art of listening for color under the skin. A person's eyes could betray a hunger when the room was full of convivial light, or a quiet grief when lampglow softened faces around a table. Enoch began to attend to the light of people's gazes, the private lightning they carried inside, and to answer in ways that matched their need. The Watcher corrected him when he was clumsy, showing that mismatched light could wound as surely as harsh words. The Watcher took him further, out of the village and into the empty places where the sun and moon conversed without an audience. They stood on plains where the horizon spoke like a truth-teller, and the Watcher used those naked spaces to strip Enoch's learning down to essentials. He explained why the sun leaned toward the equator and why the moon held to its borrowed glow, and then pushed Enoch to ask what responsibility accompanied such knowledge. Enoch's answers were tentative at first, but they hardened into commitments as the plains tested him. One lesson lasted a season: how to read the calendar of stars that wheeled like a choir overhead. The Watcher traced constellations as one traces the lines of a family tree, pointing out patterns that had guided migrations, harvests, and prayers. Enoch learned that the sky was not decorative but functional, a text to read so life could be scheduled around the sun's promises and the moon's accounting. He practiced aligning his duties with those cycles until the rhythms of his days synced with those older cadences. The Watcher gave him metaphors to carry the knowledge into the village. The sun is a bell that must be struck with intent, the moon is a ledger to be consulted with respect. These metaphors were not mere ornaments, they enabled Enoch to teach others in simple ways. He told farmers that the sunlight had a memory and that their crops would be remembered well if tended with kind measures, and he told mothers that moonlight was a quiet listener to the child's first words. People began to let their hands be shaped by these ideas and saw small changes in the steadiness of their lives. Enoch's nights were filled with experiments in shadowcraft, the gentle art of arranging light so it coaxed certain feelings into being. He learned to hang curtains not to isolate, but to curve light into patterns that soothed restlessness. He taught elders to place small lamps that made reading easier without robbing the night of its silence. The Watcher praised him for such domestic wisdom, reminding him that great revelations often have humble laboratories. The Watcher also taught him to read reflections not only as spooky echoes but as honest second opinions. A puddle might give a world that is slightly warped and therefore instructive, showing aspects not visible from above. Mirrors, shells, and polished utensils carried alternate dialects of light, and Enoch learned to consult them as a craftsman consults multiple tools while shaping meaning. He became adept at understanding how a situation looked from many angles, and how truth often appears fuller if seen in its reflected aspects. Learning the names of celestial mechanics required patience. The Watcher patiently made Enoch count things, periods of light between eclipses, the slow waxing and waning that matched human moods, the way seasons pressed memory into the bones of the earth. Enoch learned to catalog rhythms and to frame them in stories that people could use to orient themselves. This quiet counting changed him. He began keeping calendars not as bookkeeping but as ethical instruments designed to protect communities from surprise and panic. Once, the Watcher taught him a dangerous lesson in humility by showing how light could be forged into weapons. A spearhead catches sun differently than a plowshare, and that difference matters. The Watcher did not moralize but asked Enoch to recognize that knowledge without care could make a village into a battleground. Enoch realized his craft would need an inner discipline, a set of rules that would prevent insight from becoming an excuse for domination. There were moments of ecstatic clarity when the language of light opened into music and the world itself seemed to be composing an aria. Dawn on the valley rim sometimes made Enoch feel as if notes were falling like petals, each one a punctuation and a melody he could sing back. The Watcher taught him how to translate those melodies into instructions for living, when to mend, when to leave, when to plant seeds, and when to hold a vigil. Enoch found himself humming when he worked, and his neighbors began to say his home had a sound that soothed flocks and children alike. The moon introduced him to secrecy and confession by showing how light can be withheld and how withholding can make a space for truth. When the moon hid behind clouds, some things could be said without the burden of ceremony and with more honesty. Enoch watched clandestine reconciliations take place beneath veiled silver where the world was on its own terms, and he learned that not all light must be exhibited to be honest. This knowledge taught him when restraint was a moral act and when exposure was required. Enoch's hands learned to read the language of luminescence as much as his eyes. He could feel how a beam sat in the palm when he cupped it, how the sun warmed the heel of his hand differently than the back of his wrist. The Watcher guided him to use touch as a translator, to shape light into practical things, to warm a stone for a sick child, to catch the moon's chill for preserving seeds, to teach a blacksmith how to temper his metal with sun-calibrated rhythms. Those tactile lessons made his learning useful and bodily. There were ethical perplexities woven into the Watcher's instructions. Should Enoch intervene when light seemed to favor one person over another? If dawn kissed the face of a king first, did that mean the king deserved favors? The Watcher taught him a subtler truth: light's distribution was not always a moral endorsement, and Enoch's job was to redistribute care when necessary. He learned to reorient lamps in places of inequality and to stage sunlit moments for the overlooked, practices simple enough to change small tyrannies without grand gestures. He grew fond of the seasons as characters in an ongoing narrative. Spring was exuberance, summer a certain blunt generosity, autumn a careful collector of debts and memories, and winter a stern teacher of limits. The Watcher had the seasons speak to Enoch as protagonists whose speeches could be quoted in council: when to let go, when to gather in, when to give thanks. These seasonal directives became part of the village's rites and Enoch's most accessible way of translating cosmic grammar into household ethics. Enoch was compelled to learn the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge, the Watcher told him, arrives like a bright argument. Wisdom is what you do with that brightness to keep people warm. He memorized this by tending an old woman who could not see well. He arranged candles for her not for spectacle but to ease her mapping of the world. The woman, grateful, taught him a counterless lesson, that every act of learning is also an act of responsibility. There were nights the Watcher was stern and nights it was playful, and Enoch learned to accept both modes as part of the curriculum. Once, in a jesting hour, the Watcher made the stars wink in secretive patterns and asked Enoch to imagine jokes in their alignments. Laughter, the Watcher suggested, was a useful light because it could loosen rigid formations of thought and allow new alignments. Enoch practiced this and discovered that humor could be a gentle tool to manage the weight of revelation. Enoch also learned to honor silence as part of the language of light. Some truths, the Watcher said, require being witnessed and not spoken back. Their light works through the act of keeping. In the hush after a funeral, when the moon tilted and the village seemed to hold its breath, Enoch saw how silence wrapped those in grief with a kind of light that was soft but protective. He learned to retreat and allow the night to work, to trust that not every illumination needed translation. The Watcher took him into the laboratories of craftsmen to reveal how technical craft and luminous understanding were interwoven. A weaver who patterned a fabric needed to consider how daylight would reveal or obscure a motif, and a potter tuned glazes to react with certain reflections at noon. Enoch observed how artisans were really local philosophers of light, making choices that altered how the village experienced days and nights. Their trade secrets taught him the practicalities of applying celestial grammar to human needs. There was a lesson in grief, when loss itself seemed to change the way light behaved toward Enoch. After the death of his father, sunlight felt intrusive and moonlight felt accusatory, and for a while he could not translate their utterances. The Watcher stayed patient and guided him to read the subtle shifts in light that accompany morning, a dimmer hue at the window, a hesitant beam in a favorite chair. Over time, Enoch learned to harness that altered light to tell stories of the dead that were gentle rather than raw, letting their memory be illuminated without being burned. The Watcher warned him of deceitful lights, places where people arranged lanterns and mirrors to mask misdeeds. Enoch learned to look for the signs of theatrical illumination, the way shadows wore fake smiles, or how staged brightness tried to distract from creaking floors. He became adept at discerning performance from sincerity and used that skill to unmask plots and to protect those being falsely dazzled. This made him a guardian of honesty in a small, intimate way. He was given the difficult task of arguing with elders who prized grand declarations of faith over quiet, local compassion. The elders loved the sun's dramatic language, festivals of torch and flame, but sometimes their shining was an excuse to ignore the slow needs of the community. Enoch learned to translate the moon's patience into counsel, to remind the elders that true constancy requires small attentions. His voice did not always win debates, but it altered the cadence of decisions. One dawn the Watcher brought him to an ancient grove where stones caught the sun like teeth in the jaw of the earth, and there he learned the art of memorial light. The stones had been placed to remember people who'd kept vows centuries ago, and the light on each stone told the story of their promise. Enoch understood then that memory itself must be designed into the world, with markers that sunlight could touch and moonlight could comfort. He began to plant such stones in his village, places where vows could be made and revisited under appropriate illumination. In time, Enoch began to teach. Children came to him not only to learn names of things, but to feel how light could make them kinder. He taught them to notice the small courtesies of illumination, how to tilt a lamp to ease a neighbor's eye, how to choose curtains that shared light across a room. He made games of it, musical exercises where children clapped to the rhythm of the dawn. The Watcher watched him teach and nodded as if pleased that his pupil had become a conduit. There were moral lessons in the way light consumed and kept. Once Enoch watched a singer bask in the glow of public praise and saw how the light fed her pride until she closed herself off. The Watcher used this to show him how flattery could be a bright trap and how praise needed to be distributed with care. Enoch learned to craft compliments like balanced beams, giving enough to warm but not so much as to blind. He also learned the language of compromise through the moon's negotiation with tides. The moon gave up some of its shape to the sea in exchange for influence, and Enoch recognized that wise leaders do the same with human passions. He began to advise in ways that sought shared gains, arranging councils at times when the light favored calm deliberation. The Watcher praised those arrangements as luminous compromises, small alchemies that turned discord into workable weather. Enoch's dreams became longer and more vivid, and he eventually understood they were a layer in his education. In dreams, light could transform into creatures, and the sun sometimes appeared as a large honest dog that nudged him along cliffs, while the moon sometimes came as a slow raven that gathered loose edges. In these nocturnal lessons he practiced translating impossible images into actionable counsel for the waking world. The Watcher explained that dreams were a language's rehearsal room, a place to test rhetorical forms before releasing them into public life. He learned to read the health of a place by its nocturnal glow. A well-cared-for courtyard held a patient luminescence, as if the light could rest and be rested, whereas a place in ruin fought the night and yielded fractured glows. Enoch taught the village to repair their communal spaces with an eye toward restoring that gentle, continuous light, and repairing lamps became an act of civic medicine. The Watcher remarked that tending public light is analogous to tending public trust. Both are essential for collective life. The Watcher had an economy of demonstrations. He did not overwhelm him with facts, but offered controlled revelations that forced Enoch to think and decide. Once, to test his judgment, the Watcher let a moonbeam fall upon a dispute and observed what Enoch would do. Enoch chose to move the beam so it also touched the other person's face, reminding both parties that truth must be shared. The Watcher nodded, showing that wisdom isn't about seizing truth but about circulating it so the community can co-create answers. There came a test of courage when a fire threatened a cluster of houses and the sun, high and sharp, did little to help beyond making the flames more visible. The Watcher urged Enoch to think about light as a tool in emergencies, not merely a symbol. He organized neighbors to redirect light and create visible corridors for escape, to use reflective surfaces to make signals, and to place lanterns in ways that guided rather than panicked. His calm use of luminous strategy saved lives and taught him how illumination combined with action could protect the weak. Enoch was shown the deep law that light remembers promises. A pledge made at dawn had a certain resonance and a different weight when made under the moon's careful archive. He learned to choose the timing of commitments. Some vows need the sun's open honesty, others demand the moon's confidentiality. He taught his community that the when of promises mattered as much as the content, and the practice took root with rituals that married light to intention. He was given a long and patient lesson on patience itself by the sunlight that slides across moss. That persistent, slow movement taught him that important change is often gradual and relentless rather than eruptive. The Watcher had Enoch spend hours noticing the sunrise's slow crawl on stones, understanding how tiny, persistent exposures produce profound transformation over years. He carried that patience into disputes and apprenticeships, and the village benefited from the steady, recognizable cadence of his attempts at repair. Enoch discovered that light could be a moral tutor by exposing how people arrange their lives around it. He watched lovers arrange schedules to meet at dusk and saw how their secret light built a life that did not always require public approval. The Watcher emphasized that private lights, those small arrangements of care, often outlast the public fireworks of fame. Enoch made a point of honoring such quiet labors and teaching that their light was often the most trustworthy. The Watcher led him to the sea once, and there he learned the murmured language between moonlight and water, a conversation as delicate as woven hair. The moon's pull was visible in the tides, each rise and fall a sentence, and Enoch perceived in that rhythm a syntax of restraint and surrender. The sea taught him how to measure influence, not by force but by rhythm and timing. He used these insights to mediate feuds by imposing temporal structures that allowed tempers to ebb like gentle tides. A chapter of his education focused on architecture of light. The Watcher and Enoch would stand in houses and test where beams should fall to make a room hospitable. They moved thresholds, repositioned shutters, and adjusted the angle of light to direct attention toward kindness, an easy chair for the elderly placed where morning would always find them, a table set so children's work would be honored by afternoon glow. The village's houses changed subtly, gaining a new layout of intention. The Watcher taught him about inheritance, how luminous patterns pass across generations like family traits. He showed him a child whose eyes caught certain lights like their grandmother and explained how these affinities shaped life prospects. Enoch understood how to read that inheritance to help each person use their luminous inclinations without being trapped by them. He advised families to orient tasks and training around natural light affinities to cultivate strengths and to temper weaknesses. There were moral dilemmas in publishing luminous secrets to the massed world. The Watcher warned that some private illuminations should remain guarded, lest their exposure harm those who relied on them. Enoch wrestled with whether to teach the light language widely, knowing that a communal capacity to read light would uplift many but also empower dishonest schemes. He decided to proceed with caution, teaching gradually and embedding ethical instruction with technical skill. Enoch's reputation grew, but he remained wary of celebrity. The Watcher cautioned him about blinding fame, about how perpetual sunlight on a person erodes nuance. He taught Enoch to build protective shadows, places where he could step away from public glare and consult inner lights. He maintained small rituals of private moonlit walks and modest hearthlit gatherings to keep his practice honest and humane. He was taught the language of forgiveness through dawns that made everything seem possible again. The Watcher showed how a daybreak could reset a community, not by erasing memory but by reframing it in warmer tones. Enoch learned to stage reconciliations at sunrise because the sun's new sentence made it easier for wounded people to accept a different future. The ritual worked. People returned to each other with less baggage and more willingness to rebuild. There were laws about proportionate illumination in the Watcher's curriculum. You could not flood one home with the splendor meant for a ceremony without hollowing another by contrast. Enoch designed village regulations for public light during festivals, insisting on equitable distribution so no family felt ashamed. The Watcher approved, noting that light must be democratized to prevent envy and violence. He learned to mourn the erosion of ancient luminous practices, to rescue old lamps and restore the way their light used to fold bodies and make hands legible. The revival of these practices linked the village with ancestors in a tactile chain of techniques. Enoch became a conservator of luminous rituals, rescuing dying lamps like a man who recovers songs that would otherwise be forgotten. The Watcher informed him about the language of eclipses, events that compress the world's attention and force people to listen. An eclipse, the Watcher said, was a punctuation of cosmic proportions, a moment when the sun was literally asked to be patient and the moon to take center stage. Enoch watched the first eclipse with reverence and then used the quiet it brought to call for a communal fasting and renewed promises. The ritual amplified commitments because people savored the rare hush of competing lights. He developed an ability to diagnose illnesses by reading the pallor and vibrancy of a patient's environment. Subtle discolorations in a home's light could reflect a hunger years in the making or a sorrow that gnawed at sleep. Enoch counseled small environmental changes, more mourning, less artificial burn, to boost recovery and found that often these interventions eased distress more quickly than medicines alone. The Watcher taught him that health is communal and luminous arrangements are part of public medicine. Those who opposed him tried to reduce his teachings to superstition, but Enoch's results were visible and pragmatic: safer nights, more generous harvests, fewer quarrels. The Watcher advised him to maintain humility in success because every bright period contains an unseen dusk. Enoch practiced this, regularly admitting his ignorance mid-counsel and inviting others to refine his luminous judgments. He learned the importance of ritual timing, a naming ceremony at dawn, an apology at dusk, a cleaning day at the first new moon. These rituals harmonized the village's emotional weather with celestial cycles. The Watcher emphasized that ritual is not mere habit but a woven language that teaches bodies how to keep promises. Enoch saw how people became steadier under that architecture and how small pains dissolved into workable patterns. The Watcher entrusted him with a book of luminous aphorisms, not written letters but polished mirrors etched with faint grooves that responded to certain rays. When sunlight hit a mirror at the right hour, images appeared like a projector, and when moonlight found it, the mirrors sang in low silver chants. Enoch learned to use these as teaching devices, placing them in the village square to remind people of agreed ethics. They became a moral constellation, rotating their messages with sun and moon. He learned to measure the moral thickness of words by the way they took light. Some utterances soaked light like old cloth and left it dim, while others let it pass through, altering hue but remaining transparent. The Watcher taught him to prefer language that let light through, speech that did not hoard luminosity for itself but redistributed it, brightening spaces and making moral choices visible. There were hard lessons about failure. Once a lantern he sponsored malfunctioned and people were injured in the confusion. Enoch felt the shame of that misdeed like a blackened stripe of light. The Watcher did not spare him but used the disaster to teach about humility in engineering, to test, to double-check, to accept blame and repair swiftly. Repairing the harm deepened his trustworthiness. The village forgave because he did not evade responsibility. The language of light also informed music and poetry in the village. Musicians learned to play in morning keys and night modes, creating songs that matched the day's character. Enoch encouraged these experiments, seeing how sound and light combined to make communal rituals more cohesive. The Watcher pointed out that the arts are a kind of grammar that cements knowledge into joy. He learned the painful beauty of letting go by watching the last light of autumn retreat from the fields. Farmers who could not release their crops at the right time suffered frost, but those who timed grace with the year prospered. Enoch used the light language to teach acceptance, to know when enough had been done and when letting nature act is the honest course. That lesson softened many hearts and prevented ruinous hubris. Enoch noticed that his own face changed under different lights, sometimes kinder, sometimes sharper, and he began to use lamps as mirrors of who he wanted to be. He would stand by a lamp and practice speaking with gentleness until the way his mouth shaped itself matched the light. The Watcher applauded this disciplined self-crafting, noting that we often need external affordances to shape internal virtue. He saw that disputes often happened in places of poor illumination where meanings went astray, and so he reimagined conflict spaces, sugaring them with warm light and soft acoustics. Meetings once heated became calmer when bodies could see one another clearly and the light did not encourage theater. Enoch's interventions taught the village that design could foster conversation and that attention to luminous detail was an act of civic care. The Watcher introduced him to distant constellations believed to be the signatures of ancient watchers themselves. Those star patterns seemed almost like a calligraphy written with light, and the Watcher explained that some knowledge is a heritage carried in the sky to guide generations. Enoch felt the weight of stewardship then and understood that his lessons were part of a timeline longer than his small life. There were ethical puzzles about secrecy when neighboring villages sought luminous instruction for military uses. Enoch refused, arguing that light teaching must be used to heal, not to harm. The Watcher supported his stance but taught him diplomatic techniques for refusal that did not inflame tensions. He navigated the politics carefully, keeping his craft moral while avoiding needless conflicts. He learned to preserve old luminous crafts that used local materials, resisting the temptation to import shiny commodities that would change social relations. A cheap imported lamp might seem generous but could make local artisans redundant and create dependencies. Enoch cultivated local lamp making, teaching the village the careful economy of light where craft sustained community autonomy. The Watcher commended this restraint as luminous wisdom. Enoch became a storyteller of luminous ethics, telling fables about lights that became selfish and others that devoted themselves to service. These stories traveled like seeds and altered villagers' imaginations, making them more likely to choose generous illuminations. The Watcher watched Enoch's stories spread and smiled at the subtle way narrative shaped culture more deeply than any single decree. He faced a crisis when a drought changed the color of mornings into a thin, tired gray that refused to hold promise. The Watcher took him to a high plateau and showed him how small changes, like reflecting mirrors and well-arranged shade, could modify microclimates and preserve seedlings. Enoch supervised these adaptations, and slowly the mornings regained a sturdier color. The experience taught him that light language had practical climate powers when applied with care. Enoch turned drought into color again, proving that even the smallest changes can bring life back. Subscribe and tell us in the comments whether this part speaks more to your faith in change or to your belief in human strength. The Watcher taught him how to honor the marginal, how to place light into alleys and thresholds where old people sat to share gossip and wisdom. These places, once lit, revealed stories and skills that had been invisible. Enoch noticed how small illuminations could unearth long-forgotten crafts and how those recovered talents enriched community life. The Watcher said that honoring margins is a luminous investment in future resilience. Enoch learned to accept criticism when his luminous interventions did not suit everyone. Some found his rearrangements intrusive, some thought he meddled with traditions. He learned to listen, to take feedback as a being with new direction, and to adjust without losing moral anchor. The Watcher praised his humility in such adjustments as the sign of a teacher who still learns. There was a winter when the moon went dark for an unreasonable length, and fear spread that cosmic order had failed. Enoch organized nightly gatherings where they shared stories, lit small fires, and practiced the language of constrained light. The Watcher guided those evenings with low luminous gestures, teaching that in times of celestial anxiety, communal light-making stabilizes hearts. The village emerged calmer, its people having practiced mutual illumination. He learned to weave rituals for birth using both sun and moon, alternating between the sun's vitality and the moon's patient record-keeping. New mothers were staged into both lights so their children could inherit the balance. Enoch saw how such ceremonies affected children who grew up knowing the rhythm of giving and remembering, of dazzling and quietly holding. Those children became better citizens, attuned to the ethics embedded in the luminous education. The Watcher introduced him to moral taxonomy, a way to classify luminous acts by their effects: restorative lights, celebratory lights, corrective lights, and contemplative lights. Enoch found the categories useful in counseling, matching luminous remedies to social ailments. He learned to read urgency from color and responded with proportionate illumination, and in time he could diagnose the moral atmosphere of a household with only a glance. There was an episode where the sun and moon seemed to argue. The Watcher showed him that every celestial body preserved its own logic and that conflict among them did not imply cosmic failure but an invitation to humans to demonstrate reason and compassion. Enoch mediated communal anxiety, teaching that by embracing multiple cosmic logics you produce a richer human moral fabric. The lesson expanded his sense of how culture and cosmos must converse. He discovered the role of prayer in luminous stewardship, that people used light not only to see but to commune with desires and fears. He created meditative lighting for those who wanted to make vows or seek consolation, gentle arrangements that shaped breath and invited reflection. The Watcher encouraged these practices and reminded him that spiritual modes of light have consequences in the material world. Enoch grew old under these lessons and found that teaching required constant renewal, the same humility he had learned before. He mentored apprentices who sometimes understood faster and sometimes slower, and he learned to adapt his instruction. The Watcher remained a patient presence in his life, occasionally offering new riddles that kept his mind limber. One of his last revelations was that language itself evolves. The sun's sentences and the moon's margins would not always be read the same by future ears. He recorded his principles in simple objects and practices rather than in brittle treatises, so that the luminous grammar would remain alive and flexible. The Watcher praised these humble archives, noting that the living language of light survives most when it is practiced and not museum-bound. When Enoch felt his voice thin with age, he walked once more to the ridge where it had all begun and watched the horizon for a long time. The sun and moon negotiated with the same ancient dignity and new-weathered wisdom, and at last he understood the depth of the Watcher's teaching, that language of light is an apprenticeship for living well. He had learned how to distribute warmth, how to preserve shadow, how to make promises and keep them in illuminated balance. The Watcher presented a final task, to choose a single line of luminous instruction to leave as the village's anchor. Enoch hesitated, feeling the weight of every lesson he had offered. He spoke instead a compound promise, a small set of precepts wrapped in the simplicity the Watcher preferred: arrange light to reveal need, distribute praise without blinding, keep secrets that protect the vulnerable, and always choose proportion over spectacle. The Watcher nodded and seemed to release him from pupilhood into a new role of elder one who had become a guardian of gestures rather than merely a keeper of facts. He ended his days surrounded by the things he had learned to value: a lamp warmed by respectful hands, a moonlit calendar for the community, and a few mirrors placed in corners to remind people of their angles. The village kept his rituals, and children grew under the domestic and cosmic grammar he had taught, learning to align their small lives with the sun's generosity and the moon's patience. Enoch died as he had lived, with the language of light folded into his breath and given back to the community as usable grace. Years later, people still traced the edges he had taught them to notice and spoke of the man who learned the language of light from a watcher. The sun and moon continued their ancient conversations, but now they were mirrored in the village's daily acts: lamps tended with care, festivals that distributed brightness evenly, nights that honored silence and memory. The Watcher's revelation lived on not as doctrine but as a web of practices that shaped how people cooked, loved, legislated, and forgave. The final and perhaps most enduring secret Enoch had discovered and passed on was simple: light is not merely a phenomenon to be measured, but a medium that reflects the moral choices of those who use it. To shape light thoughtfully is to shape human character and community behavior. The Watcher's lessons thus became a civic ethic, a luminous language spoken in humble gestures and embodied in the steady, daily work of keeping one another visible and warm. There is a hush that settles on the road before dawn, and in that quiet Enoch steps forward as if the world has been waiting for him to break the silence. He is neither young nor old in the way that measures with years. He is a traveler whose feet remember paths the rest of us have forgotten. His eyes have learned to read the light as others read books, and the first thing he teaches is how to listen to the color of morning before the sun has fully spoken its name. Enoch does not call what he sees a map in the ordinary sense. His maps are ribbons of flame and hush of shadow, gateways carved in the fabric of the sky where the sun slips in and out as if passing through doors no human architect could build. He traces a path from horizon to horizon and calls it the path of the sun, a braided road of fire that passes through thresholds guarded and lit and sometimes locked by willful things. The first gateway rises in the east like a folded fan of light. It blooms on the breast of the horizon with the patience of a ritual, and the air around it thrums with expectation. Enoch shows how the stones and the grasses and the small, honest rivers answer to that opening by giving themselves over to gold, and he says that dawn itself is a kind of initiation. As the sun climbs, its passage is not careless, and the sky bears signatures of its transit. It moves through levels of clarity, each one a room lit differently: the chamber of thin blue, the hall of white heat, the wide, clear dome where shadow shrinks and outlines sharpen. Enoch names these thresholds in a voice that makes each syllable a key, and when he speaks they feel less like words and more like instruction. At the meridian the sun hangs as if balanced on a blade, and the world braces itself against the fullness of daylight. Here the gates have already been passed and the path widens into a plane where all things are in their most direct relationships. Enoch speaks of truth like a thing of weight and tilt, and he teaches that at this height deception cannot hide its awkwardness, it casts a shadow too wide to be ignored. Below that open noon the land breathes differently, and travelers know whether they have the strength to continue depending on how the sun shapes the light on their faces. Enoch notices how the heat draws out honesty from the soil and how water, too, becomes an honest mirror under that glare. He walks slowly, because in slow walking you observe the small betrayals of light: a leaf that will not shine, a stone that holds smoke in its grain. As the sun tilts westward, the path narrows again and brings with it gates of cooling fire. These western thresholds differ from the east. They are older, etched with the memory of every dusk that ever came down. Enoch stands at each as if bowing to a king he has known since childhood, and the colors here are not the bright new gold of morning but bruised, rich ambers and purples that carry the weight of things finished. He tells of a particular western gate that sits like a hinge over a sea, and when the sun drops through it the surface shatters into 1,000 coin lights. Boats on that sea seem to be propelled by the falling brightness itself, as though the world is an instrument tuned to follow the sun's decline. Enoch listens to the sound of light on water and says that there are songs only twilight understands, songs that teach patience and the art of keeping watch. Night is not an absence but a corridor of its own, a series of gates that the sun has left open and that the moon will navigate later. The sky turns from color into deep velvet and then into a slow, hungry black. Stars prick it with their cool teeth. Enoch speaks of guardians who pace these nocturnal thresholds, beings that keep the balance between what the sun burns away and what the dark preserves. He recounts the first time he walked the inner ways of the heavens by a ladder of light, each room a membrane of flame sealed with a different name. Through those portals he met watchers who were neither cruel nor kind but impartial, ministers of order charged to see that the sun did not spill its power in a way that would undo the woven tapestry of earth. Enoch learned from them the subtle art of crossing. You do not force a gate, you answer it, and your voice must be the correct timbre for the hinge to open. Enoch's descriptions make the heavens domestic and yet unfamiliar. He tells of rooms decorated with currents of air, of halls where gravity thins and you can hear your heartbeat echoing in a different pace. In those upper chambers, the sun seems less like a ball of fire and more like a sovereign consciousness with moods and preferences, sometimes playful and scattering light like coins, sometimes stern, compacting rays into a disciplined beam that outlines destiny. There are places where the path of the sun narrows into needles of fire that stitch the sky to the world. Enoch calls these needle gates, and they are the secret stitches that keep the seasons in order. When the sun threads through them, seeds receive the right code to wake or sleep. When it thins its stitch, the land remembers to rest. He speaks of a harvest of light and how farmers, though they may not hear the language of angels, have never been separated from the lesson their fields whisper every year. Often he pauses and watches shadows as if they are characters in a play revealing their motives. In the deep afternoons, the shadows stretch and point like actors toward exits none of us had noticed. Enoch tells a story of a shadow that once chose to refuse its role and in doing so pulled attention to a fissure in a gate of fire. The watchers repaired that fissure and reminded the shadow that each of us has a part and that rebellion rearranges worlds. He takes time to speak of the old mountains that prick the sky, for the sun's path is anchored by the land's peaks like a clothesline tethering light. Those peaks are the ancient gates braces, their rocks soaked with the residue of 1,000 dawns and dusks. Enoch climbs them to listen at higher doors where the air thins and the sun's voice becomes a bell, clearer, purer, carrying names of things that no plain conversation contains. On one such summit the air smelled of iron and the memory of rain. Enoch stood with a shepherd who had known the mountain for decades, and the shepherd told him about mornings when the gateway to fire seemed reluctant, veiled in mists that were not natural but woven. Together they watched the sun negotiate with the veil, and Enoch learned that the gates sometimes barter with clouds over the terms of entrance. Clouds, in Enoch's telling, can be brokers and thieves. They hide and reveal at will, and often they conspire with the wind to reinterpret the sun's instructions. From his place of listening, Enoch could tell when clouds were honest cover and when they were cobblers making with light a false landscape of safety. He learned to read the smell of rain in the air as an afterword of the sun's conversation with water. He insists that the journey of the sun is as much moral as it is physical. The gates of fire are tests of intention, the path a series of decisions by which the light either heals or burns. Enoch uses the metaphor of a smith at his forge. The sun is a hammer that can craft the good or scorch the grain. Those who walk the sun's path with clear hands find the gates easier to pass, because purity of aim harmonizes with the hinges. There are guardians at each gate, and Enoch names them with the precision of someone reciting family names by candlelight. Some of them look like birds of bright metal, others like men who have forgotten their own faces and wear the stars as mantles. They ask questions that are not words but images and require answers given in stance and breath. To be unprepared is to be turned back, not in judgment but in protection from what you would not yet survive. Enoch remembers a gate that required song rather than speech, a place where only the human voice could translate the sun's motion into meaning. He learned that the timbre of our singing contains codes older than memory, and that when sung sincerely it opens a path the feet can follow. So he taught songs that are not for crowds but for the individual traveler, quiet intonations that resonate with the bend of light at specific times of day. In the middle heavens, where the sun performs its daily labor, Enoch encountered courts where calculation and poetry sat side by side. The angels there counted and also gestured, and their mathematics sounded like music. Enoch tells how a pattern of light over a field was both an arithmetic and a promise, predicting the fertility of the soil and the temperament of the seasons with the same language. He develops the idea that the sun's gait changes through its path, a stride that is staccato in winter and a long, easy amble in summer, and each gait leaves a different impression on human life. People become steely and hurried under a certain narrow bright stride, or languid and generous under the long, warm arc that stretches the day. Enoch observes that cultures themselves bend under these strides, and entire societies have been shaped around the mood of sunlight. Enoch is fond of telling how the moon learns from the sun, tracing a lesson in quiet. The moon borrows light like a shy apprentice, reflecting what it cannot make, and it travels the night as a memory of what was shown during the day. He compares the moon to an old storyteller who repeats another's tale in softer tones, and sometimes embellishes it with longing. He also explores the moments when the gates do not just open but collide, for occasionally the sun and moon meet in ways that remake the sky. Eclipses are like doors clapping simultaneously on two separate worlds, and the witnesses feel a brief dislocation in the scaffolding of things. Enoch describes an eclipse as a secret negotiation between the bodies, where one borrows the authority of the other and the world holds its breath. There are daily rituals embedded in the choreography of light, small civilities the planet pays to the sun's procession. Enoch learned the etiquette of dawn and dusk, when to bend, when to shield the eyes, when to speak blessings into the air that will be carried by sunlight itself. He shares these rituals not as commandments but as customs that keep the weave of human life from fraying under extreme brightness or well of dark. He maps places where the sun's path creates living effects at dawn and dusk, long gleams that turn ordinary objects into icons. A simple cup can become an altar when the light hits its rim, a field of barley can stand as a vision of gold. Enoch insists that the world is always willing to be lit into meaning, if you stand still long enough to notice the gates through which the light arrives. The sun's path is also a seam of time, and Enoch speaks about hours like stitches in fabric. Each hour has its texture and its purpose, a workroom where different trades of attention are practiced. From the hour of slow beginnings to the hour of fading tasks, there is a choreography that belongs to civilization itself. Enoch urges listeners to honor the hours as a society of necessary acts. Enoch has rules for crossing thresholds that are at once practical and poetic. You approach a gate with awareness, you present what you carry with humility, and you accept the light you are given without trying to hoard it. These are not churchly decrees but ways of moving through the world that make the path safer and, for lack of a stronger word, kinder. He recounts meetings with the old watchers who keep ledgers made of sunlight and breath, cataloging moments when the sun favored one place over another. Those ledgers were not cold bureaucracies but living documents that flexed when humans acted with honesty. Enoch reads from them with a reverence that makes the listener feel as if the world's scales were being balanced with kind hands. There is a long sequence where he details the architecture of specific gates, not in measured blueprints but as living craft. A gate might have a frame of cloud and a threshold of heat, or it could be a ring of clear air set into the horizon like a jeweler's bezel. Each is unique, adapted to the geography it serves and the stories it must protect, and Enoch's pleasure is in cataloging how different gates behave under the same sun. He speaks of the first human to notice a gate and the consequences of that noticing. The ancient person, uncomfortable with the boundary between ordinary and extraordinary, attempted to cross it in haste and returned with hands filled with small, dangerous knowledge. Enoch tells this as a warning and as an explanation for why such thresholds were attended carefully thereafter. Enoch watches how cities align themselves to the passage, their streets shaped to bring the sun in at certain angles. Temples open their sacred doors to the light at special moments, and plazas are carved so that at noon a statue will receive an immaculate crown of sun. He points out how architecture is a human answer to the sun's path, a dialogue written in stone and shadow. In one quiet valley, Enoch studies how children learn the gates before they learn the alphabet. They call to one another in morning play, and all of it is negotiation with the light. Who can chase it? Who can hold onto a shard of it? Who will give it back by sundown? Their games are small treaties that teach the same wisdom Enoch has been taught, that to know the sun is to keep time with the world. He tells of storms that challenge the path and how lightning, in its brief ferocity, stamps temporary doors across the sky. Lightning seems to mock the slow work of the sun, forging wild gateways that collapse almost as soon as they are born. Enoch admires their urgency but ultimately trusts the patient calendars of dawn and dusk, for storms are loud messengers while the sun is a teacher of slow habits. In winter the path of the sun tightens into a narrow band, and its gates are thin as a blade's edge. Enoch describes the way this band changes people, narrowing their days and sharpening certain virtues like thrift and endurance. The cold sky becomes a crucible for inner lights and small domestic flames, and he shows how families place themselves near those lesser lights to keep vigil. Summer, by contrast, expands the path until days feel like long bright rooms where entire projects can be completed. Gates open wider, and the world invites risk and abundance. Enoch plays out scenes of busy markets, of fields full of harvesting hands, and he notes that plenty is also a test. The more light you are given, the more carefully you must use it. There is a philosophical thread that runs through Enoch's tales about the path of the sun, that light reveals but also diminishes mystery. The sun, in blasting away shadow, forces the world into clarity and in doing so makes certain enchantments less effective. Enoch mourns and celebrates this in equal measure, content that knowledge comes at cost and certain wonder is meant to be kept. The watchers who steward the gates are poets in their own right, and Enoch shares their short, sharp parables. One taught him that a gate is a promise with hinges, meant to swing but not to fall off its frame. Another said that the sun is a patient creditor, never demanding more than it has already given, and that to take its gift without reciprocity is to end up poorer spiritually. He gives long, minute attention to the colors the gates throw upon faces, because color is not indifferent to mood. A gate's flame will render a person's eyes like polished stones or like wet peat, and Enoch reads these transformations like someone reading a clock. Light is parlor and interrogation both, and he teaches how to carry oneself when caught in both places at once. There is a portion of his travels where he walks through cities built on coastlines, where gateways of fire meet mirrors of water. Here the sun splits into two choreographies, the rising that touches the sea and the setting that burns away reflected light. In these places Enoch listens to sailors and fishermen who have developed a near-religious respect for the sun's slippery progress over water. Enoch often uses botanical images, noting that plants are apprentices to the sun and that their leaves are tuned like listening devices. They accept the path as instruction manuals, unfurling with the schedule of light and folding when the gates are closed. He traces how certain trees seem to remember ancient gates, growing branches that always face a particular doorway of dawn, even if the human settlements around them have changed. He spends hours with astronomers who chart the sun's path in numbers, and he delights in the interplay between their cold measures and his warm stories. The astronomers produce tables and arcs that barely conceal a kind of devotion. Their charts are prayers written in angular measures. Enoch admires their discipline and asks them to tell him what a gate feels like, to translate sensation into formula, and they, in turn, ask him how to let tables dream. Enoch does not keep his knowledge for himself. He teaches a handful of followers how to read the seams of daylight, how to prepare for the sun's favor, and how to respect its injuries. He understands that knowledge without teaching hardens like unused metal, and so he becomes a reluctant mentor, always insisting that practice matters more than theory. His apprentices learn to move and to be still at the right times, a practice that changes their bodies to carry memory. He speaks of funerals held at the threshold of dusk where the community watches the sun go through a gate and imagines the loved one passing through a similar doorway. The ritual is not literal but symbolic, an act meant to align grief with natural rhythm so it does not become a perpetual, destructive storm. Enoch comforts and instructs in these moments, softening the light so that it becomes a balm rather than a blade. There are wild places where gates behave unpredictably, where the sun's passage can leap or pause, like a dancer improvising. Enoch tells of deserts where mirages are mistaken for extra doors and of forests where living gates open to selected travelers only. In those places the rules are local and the path requires interpretation, a skill earned by repeated caution and attentive wonder. He keeps a large ledger of moments he calls hinge cases, times when a gate changed its character because of human action. A single act of largesse in a famine, a stubborn refusal to harm in a moment of violence, a child's delighted laughter in a dire hour, these events, he says, adjust the gates slightly, softening their edges for a century or perhaps hardening them. He tells these stories slowly because they are his favorite proof that human choices matter to the sky. Throughout his narrations he returns to the figure of an old woman who tends the western gate in his hometown. She has hands like parchment and she waters plants that grow only in the last light. Enoch says she knows the wind's gossip and that when she walks the gate seems to breathe in gratitude, as if a simple, faithful presence can be itself an instrument for the passage of light. As age settles on Enoch, he grows more attentive to the small, mundane ways light is conserved and squandered. He notices how households waste their luminous hours on arguments or use them for tender acts, and he becomes impatient with those who take the gates for granted. He presses his listeners to treat their days like fragile vessels, to fill them with work and mercy so that the sun's gift does not pass unused. In his last long summer he walks more slowly along the path of the sun, visiting each familiar gate as if to say farewell. He moves with the kind of careful attention that turns every ordinary crossing into a sacrament. The gates, in return, let him pass with a kind of old friendship that does not require words, only presence. There are testimonies he collects from others who have glimpsed the same truth, a seam of possibility where the sun's path meets human destiny. These testimonies are varied, some simple and some elaborate, but all of them add texture to the same tapestry. Enoch stitches them to his own account like a patchworker honoring different hands at the loom. And so the path of the sun becomes a teaching for living, how to greet openings, how to carry outward light without burning others, how to respect the doors you do not yet understand. He teaches that every gate of fire across the sky is an invitation to practice steadiness, curiosity, and courage. The sun's path, once told, becomes a way to arrange days so that a life can be counted in small luminous acts rather than singular grand gestures. In the final strands of his instruction, Enoch returns to the interplay with the moon, the slow counterpoint that keeps the sun's music from becoming monotonous. He teaches that the moon's borrowed light is humility embodied, an echo that teaches the value of reflection. To follow both is to learn the difference between showing and being seen, between the self that needs to shine and the self that simply holds a mirror. Enoch never claims to have solved all the mysteries behind the gates of fire. He knows enough to walk and to invite others, and in that balance he is content. The sun continues its passage as it always has, indifferent to every human drama, and yet perfectly willing to be a teacher if someone will stand in its path and listen. He leaves the last words hanging like a mild dawn. We are always crossing thresholds, whether we name them or not, and the art is to cross with open hands and a watchful heart. The night begins with a slow hush, as if the world is taking a careful breath to listen. Above, the moon hangs like a patient eye, its pale face a surface that has kept more secrets than it reveals. In this story we follow an older tale, a rumor folded into legend and memory, Enoch and the Moon's hidden tablets, silent manuscripts of light and shadow that record the cycles of time itself. Enoch steps forward with the careful gait of someone who has walked between worlds. He is not merely a man of one century, but a traveler who knows the edges of things, the places where sky softens into the possibility of revelation. The tablets he seeks are not ordinary objects, they are engraved measures of motion, carved where the silver touches the dark and where the dark answers back. The moon, when you look at it with patience, begins to read itself. Craters are not only the scars of impact but punctuation, points where geological memory folds like a pressed leaf. The Maria, the smooth patches of basalt, spread like inked panels, and within them legends are said to be kept, tablets not of metal but of light, captured and stored in the deep pools of lunar time. For Enoch, the journey is patient and meticulous. He traces the moon's edge as if following the seam of an old robe, learning its rhythms with his fingers turned to the cold and its speech worn into silence. He learns to hear the tide of light, how the sun strokes the lunar surface and how shadow curls back like cloth, each fold is a sentence, each brightening a stanza. The cycles of shadow and silver are the moon's grammar. There is a waxing that is like language expanding, letters unfurling under the sun's breath, and a waning that is like punctuation, where meaning pulls back into mystery. These are the movements that the tablets expect, the cadence that reveals what can be read and what must remain hidden until the right hour. Enoch discovers that the moon hides its tablets in phases, making them available when the balance between light and dark is just so. Some tablets are visible at first quarter, their edges illuminated like the lip of a plate. Some require the fullness of moonlight, when the world is washed and the tablets glow as if lit from within. Others prefer the secrecy of the new moon, showing themselves only when the world turns its back and the sky slips into a private darkness. There is ritual in the way Enoch approaches the lunar texts. He does not rush. He observes the moon's precession, noting the synodic month as a clock that keeps human hearts and seas in rhythm. He traces with his mind the 29.5 turns that mark the full reappearance of a face, writing the cycles where memory might have slackened. The tablets respond to that patience, aligning their script with the cadence of the sky. Into these cycles step the conceptions of tides and moods. The moon's pull upon our liquids is obvious to anyone who has watched the sea breathe in and out across a shoreline. But the lunar tablets are more subtle. They map the pull upon human things, dreams, seeds, fears, and courage, registering how societies rise and fold themselves according to the moon's light. Enoch reads these annotations as if reading constellations, a code of silver and shadow that tells what the world will intend to do next. The writing on the moon does not resemble ordinary letters. It is not designed for ink and paper but for angles and fall. Script becomes shape, ridges that blush when lit, recesses that take on the sun's glow, and grooves that throw shadows long enough to be read. Enoch learns to interpret folds of brightness as verbs and hollows as nouns, a language that requires both sight and silence to comprehend. On one of his more intimate nights with the moon, Enoch feels the gentle weight of its orbit like a palm curved around his shoulder. He perceives how the moon spins in lockstep, always showing mostly the same face to Earth, and how that kinship has granted the moon authority to be both mirror and medicine to the world below. The tablets, then, are not only records, they are instruments, mechanisms that calibrate human behavior to celestial motion. There are guardians of this lunar library, though they are not all as you might imagine. Some are stone-cold and immobile, carved by impact and time into sentinels that have watched the sky for eons. Others are echoes, patterns of shadow that fold across craters and, for the keen, will gesture like a hand to indicate where a line begins. Enoch learns to read the guardians as part of the text itself, a living glossary that must be consulted. The moon's far side carries a different temperament, hidden from Earth's steady glance. It is quieter, brooding in a way that feels almost secretive, like a partner who keeps letters in a locked drawer. Enoch is drawn to that hemisphere and believes the deepest tablets sleep there, protected by seas of darker basalt and older wrinkles in the lunar crust that speak of formative fires and silence. There is a particular night when the moon performs what feels like a deliberate opening. It is during a long stretch of calm in the sky, when the stars seem close enough to pick by hand and a thin wind carries the scent of far-off rain. The surface gleams with a clarity not usually seen and, in a crater rim that has grown smoother with the slow of eons, a seam of silver lines up like a hinge. When the seam opens, the first tablet Enoch sees is not written in words but in rhythm. A pale ridge sweeps like a reed, then a shadow responds like a drum, and the interplay is as musical as any hymn. The tablets contain cycles that are not merely chronological but musical in the mathematics of intervals, the moon's phases unfolding like notes that can be played back to predict the moods of the seas and the temper of human gatherings. As the moon cycles, festivals have been timed to it across different cultures, not because of myth alone but because the lunar pulse coordinates harvest and migration, romance and mourning. The tablets do not discriminate, their markings are practical and poetic. Enoch reads them as both a farmer and a prophet, translating schedules into songs and weather patterns into elegies for deserts and gardens. Sometimes the tablets speak of eclipses, those great stage shifts when the sun and moon meet in a line and shadow swallows light. An eclipse, Enoch learns, is not only a spectacle but a turning in the book of celestial instruction. When the sun's light is momentarily taken away, a different set of tablets becomes legible, those that require a new balance of light, the voice of darkness granting passage to truths otherwise unreadable. Enoch sits beneath such an eclipse and feels his heart slow to the rhythm of a world momentarily blinded. The temperature drops as if the sun itself has breathed out, and in that cool silence the moon unclasps a tablet like a lid. There is revelation in this moment, not because the universe intends to shock but because alignment opens doors. The tablets speak then of endings and beginnings as one movement, a cycle that allows some things to close only for others to be born. The moon's light is patient, but it scratches truths into places where the sun's brilliance cannot reach. There are grooves worn into the regolith that catch starlight in ways that are nearly invisible until someone leans in. Enoch learns to trust his sense of smallness, to crouch close to the ground and let the lunar soil tell him what it has kept in the silence between two star-filled breaths. The tablets also contain measurements, quiet, practical notations on the rhythms of wind and sea. They chart the time between phases with an accuracy that would astonish any modern clockmaker, mapping the lunar month and noting the subtle variations caused by the moon's elliptical path and the pull of other planets. Enoch reads these margins and sees that the moon is not a mechanical machine but a body with mood, a gravity that tweaks its own story as other bodies tug in a cosmic conversation. This conversation takes place through the subtle phenomenon of libration, that gentle wobble that allows us on Earth to see a bit more than a simple fixed face. The tablets account for those moments, marking places where features wink into and out of view, cleverly hiding certain inscriptions until the lunar body tilts in just the right way. Enoch regards libration as a translator's quirk, a method by which the moon controls who can see the deepest lines of its script. Enoch becomes a patient student of angles. He notes how the terminator, the clean line between day and night on the moon, is where letters are easiest to read because contrast defines form. When the surface is half lit, small ridges cast long shadows and the tablet's grooves become sentences. He spends countless hours observing that boundary, learning to read the grammar of light and dark in the same way a scribe learns the pressure of a pen. The tablets hold codes for the tides, and those are not mere curiosities. The moon's pull on the oceans maps itself onto coastlines, ebb and flow tracing the hours in a script older than any city. Fishing communities have long observed the moon for timing, their elders passing down lore as if reading from worn lunar pages. Enoch collects these human annotations and writes them alongside the tablet's cosmic notations, connecting liturgy and livelihood. Beyond tides, the moon's cycles impose themselves on inner life. Men and women, communities and nations, mark their calendars by moonlight, rituals, marriages, periods of mourning, planting seasons. The tablets treat these human cycles as part of nature's own text, folding the folds of emotion and economy into a broader argument about balance. Enoch understands that the moon's handwriting is also humanity's codex for living in correlation with a larger rhythm. There are nights when the moon behaves as a lantern, showing the push and pull of light with such clarity you could read by it for hours. In these times, Enoch finds tablets that discuss the ethics of timing, when to make a vow, when to break a chain, when to remain silent. The lunar script suggests that timing can be moral. There is a rightness to certain actions that aligns with the moon's phases, and those instructions are written delicately, as if they might be lost in too much brightness. Not all tablets are gentle. Some are warnings carved in deep shadow where only the brave or desperate can see them. These pages speak of cycles of violence and reconciliation, of storms and famines that come in deliberate patterns. Enoch treats these as maps of risk. He reads them and offers counsel to communities about when to fortify their granaries, when to leave coasts, when to sing to seeds and to children. Enoch also learns of a set of tablets devoted to identity and transformation. They describe rites of passage tied to lunar phases, the way a person becomes, how inner moons wax into confidence or wane into doubt. They teach that the self is not a static entity but a monthly becoming, each phase a mirror held up to the heart. These tablets suggest that by honoring cycles, people can guide their own transformations with grace rather than shock. The moon's surface is a library written by light and preserved by cold. But there are mysteries of composition too, why some regions hold ink-like grooves while others keep smoothness. Enoch studies the Maria and their basaltic plains, discovering that impact and flow create the textures that serve as pages. The moon's geological history is thus the library's architecture, and understanding its history is necessary to understand its narrative. Enoch traces the timelines of impacts and seas, as one would reconstruct the life of an ancient town by following its streets. Each crater tells its own story in size and age and the way its ejecta wraps against neighboring structures. He finds that some tablets are actually records of collision, chronicles of meteor worlds that once passed by and left their mark, each crater a chapter with its own voice. There are instruments of reading as well. Enoch crafts lenses and mirrors, delicate devices tuned to the moon's low light and the high contrast of its terrain. He refines methods to capture the faintest inscriptions, coins of glint that appear only when the geometry of view and light is precise. He learns that seeing the tablets sometimes requires inventing a new eye, a small miracle of craft that adjusts to the moon's temper and the earth's changing vantage. When Enoch observes the moon through the centuries, he notices how human interpretation of the tablets has altered with each generation. Priests see prophecies, farmers read weather, and doctors find clocks for biological rhythms. The tablets are thus palimpsests of meaning, written over by necessity and culture. Enoch treats all readings as partial and precious, knowing that no single interpretation can hold them whole. The moon also preserves memory in a way that is not strictly chronological. Some tablets are mnemonic sculptures, patterns that anchor seasonal memories to landscape. They serve as anchors for communal recall, songs that come alive under the full moon, dances that make sense only when the tide sings, stories that require a certain pale light to be credible. Enoch calls these the moon's memory anchors and reveres them for their humility. He watches how communities converge with lunar time. In some coastal towns, market days are arranged according to lunar phases, the arrival of traders timed with the tides to ease loading and unloading. In others, festival calendars revolve around the moon's face because the light gives work and play a kind of symmetry. The tablets contain such instructions like marginal notes, eclipsed lines of advice for civic orchestration. Sometimes the moon's tablets instruct on agriculture with a precision that resembles practical botany. They suggest planting certain crops during a waxing moon to encourage outward growth and harvesting on a waning phase to preserve root vitality. Enoch learns the language of sap and seed through those notations, and he recognizes that agricultural advice tied to lunar phases often contains empirical foundations, even if wrapped in ritual prose. Enoch becomes a mediator between those who interpret the moon as omen and those who read it like a scientific chart. He bows to both modes, knowing that the tablets accept multiple readers. They will reveal moral bearings to a priest and statistical patterns to a sailor. The moon is not a dogmatic scripture but a living dossier, and its tablets are adaptable tools for different kinds of wisdom. The tablets also record the moon's long dance with the sun. There are notations that detail how the two bodies intersect upon the ecliptic, listing nodes and alignments that explain when eclipses might arise and when they will not. Enoch recognizes a pattern of recurrence across generations, families of eclipses, genealogies of shadows that return with a steady, predictable temperament. The tablets are as much about the moon's relationships as they are about the moon itself. These relationship tablets are intimate. They speak of mutual influence, describing how the sun's relentless light teaches the moon geometry while the moon's softer voice tempers the sun's blaze. In their exchange, the tablets show how each celestial body gives and takes, how gravity and light choreograph a long-term cooperation that shapes seasons and the very idea of day and night. Enoch reads this as a lesson in reciprocity, applicable to hearts and councils alike. The moon keeps a ledger for human emotion as if cataloging the economy of feeling. Some tablets list times when sorrow tends to cluster, suggesting that grief collects at certain phases as if drawn by an unseen magnet. Others note periods favorable to joy or clarity, the moon acting as a kind of communal mood manager. Enoch does not treat such entries as absolute but as sympathetic guidance for those who wish to plan their intangibles. There are also tablets that discuss navigation in metaphor as much as in tactic. Mariners use lunar phases not just for tides but as a compass for moral orientation. The moon's face becomes a clock of honesty, a marker of honesty's season or duplicity's hour. Enoch reads these tablets and sees the moon as an ethical calendar, an externalized conscience that keeps communities honest by the sheer stability of its cycles. Enoch's nights on the moon are punctuated by the presence of certain angelic or watcher-like figures, beings described in some tales as guardians of knowledge. They are not always benevolent or malevolent, they are custodians with an inscrutable taste for order. They sometimes test Enoch, asking questions and riddles, measuring his patience and humility before allowing access to certain tablets. Enoch finds that humility is often the key that opens deeper drawers of understanding. When he passes those tests, Enoch encounters tablets that feel older than the moon's own cycles, inscriptions that suggest an origin beyond simple astronomical mechanics. They speak of epochs when alignment between spheres allowed access to other planes of thought, times when the sky and the earth communicated with a clarity no longer available to modern sensibilities. Enoch treasures these pages like fossils of thought, marveling at their hints of a more permeable cosmos. The tablets also chronicle changes in the moon's light over geological time. They record the way the moon once shone closer and brighter in ancient nights, when tides were taller and nights more deeply marked by lunar influence. Enoch walks those ancient notations like the edge of an old map, feeling the scale of slow time and the way tiny forces accumulate to alter lives and coasts. He reads the lunar past as a mirror for the human story, both evolving under slow, inexorable rules. In quiet moments, Enoch thinks about language itself, how to write a history that is readable by a planet or a moon. He realizes that the tablets do not mimic human alphabets because the moon's memory is geometric and temporal rather than linear. It remembers by pattern and recurrence, by overlapping cycles that interlock like gears. To read properly, he must think in loops and spirals, and repetitions that make sense only when time is allowed to turn in on itself. As seasons pass, Enoch trains others in the art of lunar reading. He is careful not to cast the tablets as a secret hoard but as a public resource for humankind. Some students take the lessons literally and become meticulous recorders, while others interpret them through poetry and prophecy. Enoch encourages plurality of reading so that the moon's knowledge can infuse many kinds of governance and art. There are nights when the tablets speak of mortal limits. They record that not everything can be predicted or preordained by lunar cycles alone. Randomness, the tablets assert in their quiet margins, belongs to the cosmos and is part of its poetry. Enoch appreciates that humility. He learns to keep space in the human schedules for surprise, recognizing that even a well-read moon cannot account for every contingency in a world of living beings. From the lunar tablets, Enoch also learns about the moon's influence on the human body in practical terms, beyond poetic myths. He reads notes about sleep cycles and the way certain phases favor deeper rest while others encourage wakefulness. He recognizes how ancient healers timed their care by lunar rhythms, suggesting that even physiology keeps a kind of lunar time. Enoch applies these lessons in his voyages, teaching rest and vigil according to light and shadow. The tablets include diagrams of cycles within cycles, the synodic month nested within lunar nodal regressions, the way smaller rhythms ride atop longer ones. Enoch studies these like a watchmaker examining wheels within wheels, appreciating the elegance of nested motion. He composes metaphors comparing readers of the tablets to boatmen who must understand both river and current, whose safety depends on recognizing both immediate waves and longer tides. Enoch also encounters tablets that speak of translation, urging readers to be careful when moving lunar knowledge into human law or ritual. They warn that direct transplant can be violent, that metaphors must be tended like gardens lest they overrun borders. Enoch practices this caution, advocating for a careful integration of lunar wisdom into communal life, always mindful of local contexts and the plurality of human needs. There are also playful tablets, seemingly written by a wry lunar hand. These record ephemeral observations, the way a lunar ray looks particularly flattering to a certain kind of stone, the humor of a crater that resembles an old family's crest when seen from a particular angle. Enoch loves these as a reminder that the moon has personality and that the tablets are not all moralizing or mathematical. They contain whimsy, a lunar chuckle scattered among the more serious pages. At times, the tablets reveal histories of art and music linked to the moon. They catalog rhythms favored in different phases and give suggestions for chord progressions that match the ascent of a waxing crescent or the languor of a waning gibbous. Artists consult these pages and find that their creations harmonize more fully with communal feeling when staged under appropriate lunar light. Enoch learns that beauty, like agriculture, follows patterns and that aligning form to phase can magnify its resonance. The moon keeps certain private tablets as well, accessible only through particular ritual acts of attention. These involve long stretches of quiet, controlled breathing, and acts of humility. Enoch learns them slowly, understanding that the deepest insights require not force but consent. The moon will offer its most intimate pages only to those who quiet their own noise and listen with disciplined patience. In one especially cold season, Enoch meets a tablet that acts like a compass for moral complexity. It suggests that human plans should be timed so as not to overrun the cycles of rest embedded in the lunar rhythm. The tablet teaches that boom must follow lull and that arrogance towards timing leads to collapse. Enoch takes this counsel to traveling councils, telling leaders to schedule their efforts with attention to the moonlit hour. Time, as written on the tablets, is not a straight arrow but a braided path. The lunar pages encourage readers to see events as loops that return with altered shapes. Enoch reads about revolutions of habit and habit's revolution, noting the wisdom in practices that renew rather than extinguish resources. The moon's conservative mathematic offers sustainability as a rhythm rather than a rule. There are warnings too about colonizing changes without regard to rhythm. The tablets speak of civilizations that tried to force synchronization where none could naturally occur, and those texts read like elegy. Enoch learns that the moon's laws are not only about convenience but about adaptation. Communities that aligned produced abundance, while those that attempted to override the moon's cadence found themselves in harsh cycles of failure. Enoch's relationship with the moon becomes intimate enough that he can sense tiny variations in its mood. Sometimes he perceives a subtle dimming like a thinker pausing mid-sentence. Sometimes the moon exudes a bright, almost impatient clarity. These moods, the tablets explain, are caused by distant interactions, gravity's slow persuasion, small meteoric accumulations, and the changing orientation of Earth's own wobble. Enoch reads these fluctuations like a chef tasting a stew, noticing tiny differences and adjusting accordingly. Some tablets function as social engineering blueprints for communities. They show how cooperative behavior can be strengthened by synchronizing schedules to the lunar month, markets that turn over with the moon, councils that meet on particular nights, and rituals that regularize grieving. Enoch does not force these structures but recommends them as experiments in social rhythm, emphasizing consent and local choice. The tablets reveal an astonishing series of lunar names and epitaphs for phases, old names that communities once used to mark the subtle distinctions between crescents and gibbous shapes. These names map to weather, pests, and animal behaviors with uncanny accuracy. Enoch records and preserves them, feeling like a folklorist gathering a constellation of dialects each aligned with the moon's nuance. He also discovers that the moon's tablets are responsive, that their inscriptions shift with long-term change. The script adapts to tidal breaking, to accumulated regolith, to the slow recession of lunar orbit. Enoch watches the tablets slowly update, their grooves rounding with the moon's own softening, as if the lunar tongue has a living grammar that grows and simplifies across epochs. The moon also carries a ledger of secret treaties between celestial bodies, mythic in tone, proposing that the moon once brokered peace among wandering comets and arguing that such pacts are remembered as shapes in the night. Enoch reads these with skepticism and wonder. He knows they could be metaphor, but he admits that in a cosmos of movement, negotiation among bodies is a plausible way to think about systemic stability. The ancient tablets sometimes speak in parable. They tell stories of how a small light steadied a wandering ship, how a crescent reminded a despondent woman that her heart could grow again. Enoch learns that the moon's instruction is not only technical but narrative, parable as data, story as advisory system. This approach infuses the tablets with practicality wrapped in image, a pedagogy that moves both mind and heart. There are portions of the library that resist human language entirely. These are patterns of reflection that shift with the angle of the sun, images better felt than spoken, a geometry of light that conveys meaning through immediate perception rather than translation. Enoch, who is comfortable with paradox, treats these as living poems. He learns to hold them against silence and feel their message as an internal tide. The tablets also record a long series of folkloric remedies linked to phases of the moon, advising medicaments timed to lunar intervals and charms read beneath particular crescents. Some of these therapies are practical, guided by cycles of sleep and activity. Others belong clearly to belief and community cohesion, and Enoch respects both for their power to heal, whether by physiology or by shared narrative. Enoch finds tablets that speak to thresholds: when a boy becomes a man, when a grove becomes a sacred place, when a shore is no longer safe to settle. The moon marks these thresholds not only with a calendar but with tone, the way certain phases carry a solemnity or exhilaration that human bodies feel. He learns that thresholds are not only symbolic but functional, times when actions have greater consequence and need clearer intention. In the depth of his studies, Enoch realizes that the moon's tablets are also instructions for listening, how to structure attention and cultivate a patience that allows subtlety to be seen. He teaches apprentices ways of quieting breath and softening gaze so that the moon's more delicate script will present itself. The art of attention becomes as central to lunar wisdom as any chart or formula. There are tablets that Enoch does not take lightly, those concerned with justice and timing. They assert that revenge, like planting, must be timed such that its consequences are understood and contained. These metaphors are practical. They instruct judges and leaders to wait for clarity, to allow cooling cycles before adjudication. Enoch sees the moon as a teacher of restraint, whose cycles recommend deliberation over haste. The tablets also preserve music of the sphere's metaphors, notes for ceremonies meant to align human work with lunar motion. Enoch listens as choirs of wind and water seem to respond to certain phase-based scales, and he notes that human-made music seems to resonate more when timed to lunar light. The moon's tablets become a reference for composing melodies meant to anchor communities in time and memory. Ancillary devices are recorded too: shadow clocks and graduated stones that act as markers of lunar hour. These pragmatic artifacts teach people how to measure the subtle advances of light across a night, how to time rituals or labor with lunar increments. Enoch becomes a teacher of these instruments, helping communities build simple devices that convert abstract cycles into usable measures. He also finds tablets concerned with commerce. They recommend market rhythms and shipping patterns that minimize loss and maximize the use of tides. The moon's counsel is practical: align trade with tidal ease, schedule harvest markets to phases that preserve goods, and recognize that the lunar month is a steady unit for planning. Enoch sees these entries as evidence that the moon's tablets were meant to be used, not worshipped as objects of blind faith. There are tablets that contain poetic meditations on decay and repair. They teach that decline is part of any cycle and that repair is scheduled by the moon with its quiet insistence on restoration. Enoch reads about the art of repair, mending nets on a waning moon, replanting hedgerows when the crescent promises growth, as rituals that bind communities together with steady, manageable work. Interspersed with pragmatic guidance are cautionary tales written in lunar shadow. They tell of leaders who ignored the moon's rhythms and brought ruin on their people, of gardens planted in arrogance and cities razed too quickly. Enoch reads these as both myth and case study. He understands that such tales serve a social function, to educate not through dry instruction but through story whose moral is felt in the bones. There are nights when Enoch feels the loneliness of his study. The moon is a luminous partner, but it cannot hold conversation in the way human companions can. In those hours he reads tablets that describe ways to hold solitude as sacred, the moonlit vigil as a practice that refines will and teaches endurance. These entries comfort him, instructing that solitude, timed and tended, can become a communal resource when it is shared as ritual. He traces lunar references to birth and death, seeing how communities schedule those great transitions with lunar sympathy. Birth is sometimes taught to align with certain crescents believed to bless vigor, while funerals are timed to phases thought to ease passage. The tablets do not claim absolute control over such mysteries, but they offer frameworks that have comforted and organized countless families over generations. Enoch especially admires tablets that treat small acts of daily living as ritual. They suggest that washing in moonlight once in a month can serve to refresh memory and place. They recommend speaking aloud names of those we love under certain phases as a means of anchoring affection. The tablets present these acts not as superstitions but as practices of mindfulness and connection. There are also tablets of architecture, blueprints that advise how to orient houses and communal spaces to best capture moonlight at specific seasons. Windward facades, sheltered courtyards, and reflective surfaces are recommended to shape light into usable warmth and guidance. Enoch becomes an advisor in building. He helps communities design spaces that take lunar phases into account as if integrating another member of the household. Enoch's work involves teaching the ethics of seeking knowledge. The lunar tablets are not to be hoarded by elites, he insists, because the cycles they record affect everyone. He advocates for public reading spaces where the moon's pages can be consulted by sailors, midwives, farmers, and poets alike. Through this, lunar wisdom becomes woven into civic life rather than held as a cult privilege. The moon scripts sometimes insist on the value of errors. They suggest that reading mistakes are instructive, that miscalibrations and timing teach corrective arts. Enoch appreciates this humility. The moon itself does not pretend to be infallible, and the tablets sometimes annotate their own uncertainties with small, candid marks. He regards those as invitations to continual learning rather than failures. He finds that the moon's knowledge has migratory capacity. It travels with people through trade and conquest, adapting to new climates and cultures. The basic lunar cycle remains useful across seas, but local adaptations shift emphasis. In some deserts, the moon's coolness becomes a source of poetry and survival strategies. On mountains, the moon's pull is measured differently through snowmelt. Enoch respects this adaptability and promotes local translation as a civic courtesy. The tablets also record a sensitive charting of loss, the slow vanishing of certain lunar features to human view as dust and erosion rework the surface. The moon's library is not immutable, it changes and sometimes loses lines. Enoch develops techniques to preserve fragile inscriptions, casting, tracing, and teaching redundant ways of recording so that the lunar memory can be transmitted through fallible hands. There are profound ethical tablets devoted to stewardship. They teach that learning the moon's cycles brings a responsibility to tend the cycles of life on Earth. Enoch uses such pages to counsel communities toward restraint in exploiting resources, proposing that the moon's rhythm suggests a middle way between feast and famine. He frames stewardship as a form of listening, a practice of aligning governance to longer, steadier pulses than the hungry moment. He records rituals of reconciliation drawn from the moon's pages, gatherings held under particular phases where disputes are aired and mediated in a space that the moon's rhythm seems to sanctify. The tablets describe how the tone of light can soften tempers or sharpen focus, thereby aiding in the restoration of damaged relationships. Enoch watches as communities adopt such lunar courthouses and finds his belief in the moon's social utility deepened. Within the library, Enoch finds an archive of dreams, catalogs of recurring symbolic images that show up when certain phases predominate. These dream tablets suggest that certain archetypes bloom under certain lights: water dreams during full moons, flight dreams at certain crescents, and ancestral visions at eclipses. Enoch treats these as a psychological complement to the physical charts, seeing an integrated map of inner and outer cycles. The moon's tablets speak of the pleasure and danger of naming. They warn that naming a phase or practice will solidify it and thus change it. Enoch contemplates this and approaches his transcription work with care, often leaving certain names as local or poetic rather than canonical. He believes that some freedom of ambiguity helps maintain the moon's capacity to shift and respond. There are secrets about reflection itself, the way moonlight bounces off water and glass, creating doubled images that can hint at alternate truths. Enoch reads tablets that instruct on reading mirrors of water as if they were textual palimpsests. He becomes adept at decoding reflections, seeing how they offer both clarity and deception depending on angle and intention. He studies how the moon holds fire's memory, recording ancient volcanic activity in cooled flows and glassy surfaces. Those formations act as palimpsests bearing long histories, and Enoch reads them with geological humility. He learns that writing is not only human-made but nature-made. The moon's own processes inscribe events in ways as eloquent as any human hand. There are also tablets filled with cross-cultural notes, observations from travelers who carried lunar lore across oceans. Enoch reads these like letters, marveling at how different peoples attach different meanings to the same phase. He recognizes the moon as a shared human artifact, an intersubjective mirror where each culture finds its own reflection and speaks accordingly. On nights of rare clarity, Enoch can see the faint outlines of the moon's slow history of capture and change. He reads tablets that seem to be older than even the oldest myths, grammar of a sky that once had other faces. He stares into those archaic lines with the wonder of someone who recognizes that his reading is a continuity of hearing, a duty to keep attentive to the long whisper of the cosmos. The moon's tablets sometimes instruct on rhythm as a spiritual discipline. They recommend practices of aligning morning prayers with the moon's decline or of scheduling gratitude on crescents that symbolize growth. Enoch finds that such spiritual exercises are practical in stabilizing communities. When people meet regularly in phase-aligned rituals, social bonds tighten and cooperation improves. He learns that the moon's face has been a muse for poets across ages. The tablets preserve lines of verse and advice on meter that align with specific phases, creating a lunar poetics. Enoch delights in these entries, understanding that art and pattern are not marginal to survival but central to a culture's ability to hold complexity with grace. There are times when Enoch encounters contradiction within the tablets, entries that oppose one another depending on latitude or historical epoch. He takes these contradictions seriously and sees them as an argument for plural reading. The moon's library prefers multiplicity, advising against monolithic claims and urging readers to reconcile differences through local wisdom rather than doctrinal imposition. The tablets include instruction on human cycles of care, methods for timing communal care work, rotation of duties, and rest periods so that no one is overburdened across a lunar month. These practical notations read like a compassionate economy, acknowledging that care is an ongoing labor that needs pacing. Enoch carries these lessons into practice, advocating for social designs that account for human vulnerability and renewal. He finds the moon's humor in crooked inscriptions that seem to poke at human seriousness. Little marginal notes make wry observations about human foibles, how people swear fidelity on full moons but forget on workdays, how councils convene with high rhetoric and dissolve with morning light. Enoch keeps these as reminders not to allow reverence for the tablets to ossify into sternness. The Moonlight Library even contains lessons on optics. tablets describe how polarization and scattering affect how light reads surfaces, offering rudimentary advice on using layered screens and reflective stones to amplify faint inscriptions. Enoch experiments with these technologies, combining craft and ingenuity to coax out lines that had been nearly lost to the abrasion of time. There are tablets about migration and the moon's role in guiding creatures across continents and seas. Birds, turtles, and other travelers sense lunar cues in ways that archives cannot easily quantify, but the tablets offer observational notes connecting migrations to particular phases and moonlit patterns. Enoch documents these to help communities plan conservation and to respect the migratory calendars that biodiversity depends on. Some tablets appear as counterpoint to human hubris, pointing out that the moon's cycles will outlast empires and that humility in the face of cosmic duration is wise policy. They recommend that leaders think beyond immediate gains and orient projects to the scale of long cycles, building institutions that can survive the slow turn of the moon. Enoch takes this as a program for stewardship, arguing that the moon's steadiness is a model for political patience. The tablets also offer metaphors for aging. They instruct that life follows phase-like arcs: growth, fullness, decline, and renewal. These models comfort elders and children alike by placing personal transitions within a larger rhythm that dignifies every stage. Enoch shares such readings in villages, helping people see their lives as part of a natural cycle rather than a linear fall into obsolescence. There are pragmatic entries advising on travel safety, recommending departures timed with certain phases for better visibility and calmer seas. They assume adaptive learning. Communities that heeded the moon found travel less fraught and trade more reliable. Enoch aggregates these into comprehensive guides that sailors and caravanners adopt across routes. The moon's tablets are sometimes sorrowful. They record the grief of lost ones and the ways communities memorialize them under specific light. The tablets suggest ceremonies under waning moons that contain the mourner's energy and release it slowly back to the world. Enoch studies these and helps design rites that support grieving while grounding communities in a shared cycle of consolation. There are lines that teach patience in creation: slow building, slow art, slow governance. The moon discourages haste, the tablets consistently advising long horizons and repair rather than grandiose, brittle projects. Enoch pleasures in the slow craft of life, advocating practices that enrich rather than exhaust soil, time, and spirit. Sometimes tablets recount the loneliness of the moon itself, a satellite that knows weird solitude despite being seen nightly by billions. They personify lunar isolation in poems that make Enoch ache for the cosmic body. These tender pages teach compassion for loneliness, offering rituals of outreach and remembrance for those who feel apart from communal circles. The moon's tablets also function as calendars for ritual law, suggesting times for oaths and holy observances. In doing so, they provide a scaffolding for social order that is neither arbitrary nor purely legalistic. Enoch sees in this an elegant merging of rhythm and governance, law as a careful choreography with the moon as a metronome. Enoch discovers tables that provide recipes for phase-sensitive dyes and pigments, practical knowledge for artists and clothiers who need colors that look particular in moonlight. The tablets guide choices of materials so that garments and banners carry specific lunar resonances during festivals. Enoch marvels at this intersection of aesthetic and practical knowledge, seeing a moon-infused craft tradition flourish. There are instructions about midwifery and the timing of births with lunar assistance, offering mothers guidance on practices believed to ease labor. Enoch treats these with care, understanding the mix of empirical observation and cultural confidence that such protocols entail. He supports midwives who use lunar timing as part of a broader, medically grounded approach to care. The lunar tablets sometimes reveal deeper philosophical questions about chance and necessity. They wrestle with whether cycles determine fate or simply offer orientation. Enoch finds the tablets advocate for a partnership. Cycles provide structure, but human intention and wisdom shape outcomes within that frame. This view resists fatalism while promoting coherent planning. There are small, intimate records of love, poems and confessions carved into the lunar memory and preserved as if by a communal scrapbook. Young lovers carve promises into small reflective stones and bring them into moonlit circles where the tablets absorb and echo their vows. Enoch reads these tender inscriptions and is heartened by how the moon's cycles nourish attachment and ritualize care. The tablets include admonitions against violence in certain phases, arguing that rage and burn are often eclipsed by the moon's gentler influences. They encourage conflict resolution during phases associated with calm to reduce escalation. Enoch sees this as an early study in thermodynamics of social interaction, a regulation of heat through timing and ritual. At certain junctures, Enoch finds lists of mountain passes and coastal channels where moonlight is a literal lifesaver, each entry annotated with advice on traveling safely, where to camp, and where to set fires so that smoke does not chase migration patterns. The tablets thus become a guidebook for safe passage and survival in a world where light is as practical as food or shelter. He discovers that some tablets are playful exercises in cognition, puzzles cast in light and shadow that train the mind to notice subtle differences in phase and angle. These brain-stretching exercises are used by navigators and strategists to hone perception. Enoch uses them to cultivate a culture of attentional refinement, valuing careful observation as a civic skill. There are tablets that detail lunar influences on metals and alloys, noting that certain phases yield better results in forging and tempering. Blacksmiths have long used moonbench rituals, and the tablets offer both empirical notes and ceremonial scaffolding to keep craft within cohesive social frameworks. Enoch respects craftspeople who weave lunar time into their labor as another form of practical devotion. The moon's library contains genealogies as well, lists of families who have stewarded lunar knowledge across generations, passing down techniques of reading and ceremonial practice. Enoch sees that stewardship is often familial and communal, and he designs institutions to prevent monopolization, ensuring continuity without hereditary privilege. Through all this, Enoch recognizes that the moon's tablets serve as a bridge between the sensible world and deeper meaning. They guide work and ritual, time and art, law and tenderness. They teach timing as a moral and practical art, a way of arranging life so that human projects harmonize with celestial patience. When the moon grows thin at the end of its cycle, Enoch reads of endings not as annihilations but as necessary compressions before new growth. The tablets advise closing some doors to allow others to open, prescribing pauses as a form of creative discipline. Enoch cherishes these pages, seeing in them the same wisdom he has learned through careful attention to the daily smallnesses of life. At the core of the moon's hidden tablets is the idea that cycles teach humility and resilience. They invite communities to orient themselves to a slow music, to learn pacing and repair, to weave rituals that protect the fragile. Enoch, who has now become an elder of this lunar lore, continues to read with the same patient curiosity with which he first approached the moon years ago, ever aware that each phase will reveal another margin to explore. Enoch came to the edge of the world when he was still young enough to believe that the horizon would answer him, and old enough to know that answers sometimes come dressed in riddles. He stood on a plain of river grass and stones warmed by a sun that seemed to look at him with something like curiosity. The day leaned over the earth like a sage, and the night gathered herself in soft cloaks. Together they waited, as if eager for a confession or a question that would break the long silence between light and shadow. He had heard the elders speak of days and nights as simple measures of time for harvesting and prayer, for sleeping and waking, but he felt the truth was deeper, secreted in patterns that thrummed beneath routine. Enoch's bones knew the rhythm of planting and reaping. His heart had stored the cadence of lullabies hummed under lamplight. What he wanted was not a calendar. He wanted the voice of time to tell him why it sang in that tune. On the morning he decided to listen, the air was thin and shimmering, as if the world had been polished in anticipation. The sun rose as it always did, a slow, imperial ascent that colored the sky from pewter to honey, but the light laid itself differently that day, carving small, patient lanes into the fields like fingers searching for a lost story. Night did not hurry to let go. She lingered in the hollows and whispered through the reeds, folding her dark hands slowly as if to mark a proper leave-taking. Enoch crouched beside a well rimmed with moss and looked into the glass of water that caught both sun and shadow. He spoke softly, not because he expected the sky to answer with noise, but because miracles often begin as quiet breaches of ordinary speech. The first reply came as a warmth across his face, and the sun's voice was not a sound but a knowing pressure, the kind a hand carries when it remembers a name. Day told him that to know the sun was to learn the anatomy of beginnings. The sun confessed that each rise was a ceremony of unblinking attention, a promise to return, to bring those who lived by its intervals new chances to see and be seen. It dressed ordinary hours in gold, and its secret was that gold was only a costume. The real work was the attention that it dispersed like seeds. Night answered from the cool of the well, and its voice wove with the sun's like breath in a shared song. Night said she was not simply a cloak but a shapekeeper, that she loved the world for its silhouettes and slow revelations. Her secret, she told Enoch, was an economy of hiding, that what was unseen for a time can grow in potency, and that the moon's borrowed light was a lesson in humility, a light that owed its beauty to another's plenitude. Enoch asked about the moon then, because the moon had always been a companion to stories and lovers and thieves. The moon, when she turned to him, spoke like a traveler who had learned many languages and had the patience to explain small differences. She said that her light was not lesser, it was a conversation with memory, a way of keeping time in the margins, and that she tracked the tides of the heart as surely as the tides of the sea. The sun chuckled softly at that, a bright spill of amusement, showing him that joy had a texture like heat. It explained how it measured the day in degrees of visible business, work, leisure, sleep, and excess. It claimed the worship of rulers and the complicity of clocks, but it admitted a loneliness, an immutable forwardness that could not step back, a momentum that pressed all things to become. Night listened and let the moon speak. The moon confessed that she borrowed more than light. She borrowed influence, names, and rituals, wearing them as silks stitched with the histories of people. She worked in cycles so slow they were almost invisible to those who lived only for profit and conquest, but those attuned to gardens and births and the small economies of trust could read her like a ledger. She taught Enoch patterns, crescents as beginnings, full moons as culminations, waning moons as permitted redundancies. As the conversation deepened, neither day nor night used words the way humans do. They offered metaphors and sensations that Enoch, who had the patience of the river and the hunger of a pupil, translated into questions. He wanted to know how they managed the planets, the winds, the seasons. The sun spoke of governance and obligation, the moon of cycles and listening, and night, wise night, spoke last of the necessity for balance and the danger of monotony. Enoch learned there were guardians at the margins, beings not wholly light nor wholly dark who tended thresholds. They kept catalogues of dawns and dusks, of the rare mornings when the air itself seemed to conspire against ordinary days. These guardians would mend the seams where day and night met, sewing crescent to horizon, weaving dusk like a hem that held the world's clothes together. Their work was invisible because it required invisibility. Great maintenance of the universe happens by the hands no one sees. He asked about eclipses because eclipses had always felt like the sky's secret grievances or reconciliations. The sun spoke gravely. Eclipses were negotiations, moments when pride and humility met in public and the world paused to notice the choreography. The moon said eclipses were lessons in humility, reminders that light is never absolute and that every body, however bright, can be occluded. Night added that eclipses are thin time, a place where the usual textures of day and night rub raw and expose threads seldom observed. Enoch listened to stories about the first calendar and how people learned to fold months into seasons, learned that planting required measurement and mourning required memory. The sun had been stubborn and literal at the start, so early calendars leaned on visible events, harvests, floods, migrations, and the moon supplied the rhythm of sleeping and waking. Over generations, humans built scaffolds of stone and song to support those rhythms, aligning them with holy days and marketplaces, weddings and funerals. He walked through ancient cities in his mind as the sun told histories, and saw that clock towers were not neutral, they were proclamations. A clock tower declared who controlled the interval and whose labor would be sacred at which hours. The sun confessed that faith and power often traded places, using daylight as a warrant. Night, being kinder, said she watched the unsanctioned hours when people loved and conspired, wept and healed, and that those acts mattered as deeply as any decree. The moon revealed the secret of tides with a patience that made the ocean seem a schoolroom. She explained how water remembers the pull of bodies like teeth remembering a bite, how the sea lifts and lowers because of an intimate tugging that is part arithmetic and part old affection. She told Enoch that this lesson applied everywhere, to the rise of empires and the fall of reputations, to the way grief withdraws and returns and swells that sculpt the inner shorelines of a life. They slowed time for him in other ways too, teaching Enoch to notice the small mechanisms that anchor our days. The sun showed him light passing through a window, gilding dust motes into a private galaxy. The moon taught him shadows at midnight that lengthened like stories told in low voices. Night taught him that silence is not merely the absence of sound, it is an architecture where certain things become easier to see. Day taught that noise is not simply chaos, it can be a language of industry and celebration. Enoch took notes in the book he carried, not ink on paper but impressions that settled into his bones like marrow. He wrote lines in the air with his fingers, and the wind preserved those lines and ripples that people later read as omens. The sun laughed because human marks always wanted to be permanent, as if anything could hold the truth without change. Night said permanence is a vanity, all truth must be portable, carried by hearts that can bend. He pressed the sun about the names of hours, curious why some hours tasted blue and others tasted red. The sun told him that names are small spells, and labels shape conduct. Morning is a vow, noon a duty, dusk a reconciliation. The moon then taught him the names of nights, the watchful night for sailors, the dreaming night for poets, the grief-stricken night for those learning to let go. Words, the moon said, carve the world into places we can enter without fear. They spoke of navigation, and Enoch felt homesickness for distant cities that had never been his. The sun admitted pride in upright poles and compassed roses that named the world in straight lines. The moon, more forgiving, loved crooked paths that meandered by landmarks, an old oak, a stone with a strange face, a woman who sang at dusk. Night recalled that navigators also watch for the quiet lights, animals, fires, the far blink of a lover's window. Enoch asked if the stars conversed with day and night, and they revealed councils where constellations argued endlessly about who would be the harbinger of a hunter, a mother, a storm. The stars spoke in pattern and rumor, each a tiny archivist of human longing, a catalogue of names and stories that held their light steady. The sun listened indulgently and the moon winked. Together they admitted that stars are patient teachers, their lessons slow as stone and as deep as the idea of ancestry. He wanted to understand prophecy, and the moon offered a simple image. Prophecy is a moonlight that decides to climb a wall and reveal what lies behind. Sometimes it is generous, sometimes it is cruel, but it always shows only a slice, leaving people to imagine the rest. The Sun, more direct, said prophecy is a map that is also a command. It creates routes by insisting things be known in a certain way. Day and night taught him rituals that towns used to align themselves to celestial rhythms. There were dawn songs to bless seeds and dusk laments to close wounds. These rituals bonded people across distances and generations like the stitches of a great communal garment. The Sun observed that rituals can be truncated into roles of power, used to demand obedience rather than foster attention. Night countered that rituals, when honest, are promises renewed, little oaths that teach people to notice one another's hands. They spoke of children then, and Enoch pictured small faces tilted up at the sky, not yet calcified by cynicism. The moon loved children because they read her light like a toy, and she told him that their dreams keep months alive. The Sun warmed the idea, saying that teaching a child the hours is giving them a skeleton on which to hang a life of meaning. Both agreed that the first lessons in time are taught at the knee with stories and a hand on the shoulder. Enoch asked if time could be cheated, if hours could be stretched like leather or folded like cloth. The Sun said that certain moments swell when attention is paid: births, deaths, first kisses, last words. These carry a density that makes them seem to hold more than their share of hours. Night said there are pockets of time where memory thickens, moments away from monotony that become sacraments in private. The moon, watching tides, described a strange arithmetic where grief sometimes multiplies minutes into lessons. He wondered about the architecture of temples built to the sun and the moon, the altars that caught light and shadow with equal devotion. Day explained how temples are geometry made sacred. They are mirrors for the sun's generosity, aligning stones to dawn and ceilings to sunset. Night noted that moon temples were less rigid, curving spaces that accommodated gatherings that came alive with low song and soft laughter. Both agreed that any building devoted to time must leave room for surprise, otherwise, it shrinks into a mausoleum. Enoch traveled in imagination to deserts where the sun's bare presence carved truth in the skin of the land. There the sun was a relentless tutor, exposing everything to a glare that left no secrets unblended. He also pictured forests where the moon dappled leaves and insects made small choruses, teaching patience and camouflage. Together these places taught him that the sun disciplines in light and the moon instructs in shade. They told of the first clocks carved by hands who wanted to cage the day into smaller portions. Those clocks were primitive, counting grains or water drops, and each invention bore the fingerprints of its maker's anxieties. The Sun shrugged. Every human device to measure time is both an invention and a prayer. Night added that clockwork often forgets the human heart, and that hearts keep their own time, which resists neat division. Enoch asked about mourning and solace, because he had watched fields be tilled and fill with both births and griefs. Night said mourning stretches like moonlight over a house, lowering and lifting like a shutter, and that solace is sometimes a small light placed at the bedside. The Sun explained that daylight gives structure to sorrow, mapping it into days that can be weathered. The moon taught that grief possesses a patience. It does not ask to be cured, only to be seen. They described old feuds between day and night, not hostile wars but long severities of misunderstanding. Sometimes day would march too bright, erasing the delicate work of night, exposing secrets that were meant to be kept. Night, in response, withdrew too far into secrecy, making wounds rot in silence. Enoch listened as they spoke of compromise, learning that balance is a conversation, not an achievement. Enoch learned the language of thresholds, how morning neither arrives nor departs without a certain negotiation of color and chirp. Dawn is not an instant but a negotiation where light bribes shadow with speed, where birds alter their songs to fit a new chord. Dusk is the opposite negotiation, It is the earth's exhale, a lengthening of shadows and a reddening of things that had been sharp and busy. They taught him about calendars that failed and festivals that endured, how some civilizations tried to rewrite time to suit conquest and profit. The sun had seen kings shift months to exact tribute, and the moon had witnessed priests reshuffle feasts to fit doctrine. Night observed that when time is rewritten to obey the powerful, people often resist in quiet ways. They continue to mark anniversaries in private, to hold on to small, subversive moons. He asked about the older ones who remembered both ways, shamans and sailors who read both sky and shadow. The moon loved them because they carried both star charts and lullabies, allowing them to navigate seas and terrors with equal competence. The sun admired their stubborn practicality. They could measure storms and births with the same compass. Night honored their stories because they acted as living bridges between eras, between methods of knowing and being. The conversation turned to music, and Enoch heard a new explanation for rhythms he had once thought trivial. The sun explained cadence as the world's way of repeating itself until patterns were learned. The moon described harmony as the patient arranging of intervals so that differences enriched rather than clashed, like tides that compose a coastline over centuries. Night supplied the silence between notes, insisting that rest is as important as sound. They discussed inventions born of celestial curiosity, sundials, hourglasses, water clocks, and Enoch saw how each device was a human answer to a desire for order. The sun commended sundials as honest tools because they rely on the sun's direct gaze. The moon admitted water clocks felt mysterious and intimate, like counting breath or measuring a lover's pulse. Night said that tools must not become masters, otherwise, people start to live by machines rather than rhythm. Enoch felt the weight of myth pressing at the edges of the discussion, gods named for light and dark, bargains struck on altars of weather and need. The sun had been deified for its bounties, which encouraged festivals, taxes, and monuments. The moon had been called mother and trickster, servant and oracle, which made her work unpredictable and beloved. Night reminded him that myths are mnemonic devices. They don't always tell the literal truth, but they contain logic about how a people survive time. They explained the rites of passage that the sky favors: birth under a certain moon, marriage at a favorable hour, burial time so the dead sail east with the morning. The sun liked alignments that conferred social legitimacy. The moon cared more for intimate cycles, when a body was ready to be a mother or a person ready to be called elder. Night counseled that rites must always be flexible enough to hold exceptions, for life refuses to be standardized. Enoch asked about the poets who claim the night as a tutor, and the sun confessed that poets need both suns and moons because some verses require light and others demand darkness. The moon delighted in poets who could find subtlety in shadow and let metaphors bloom there. Night praised language that could shelter contradiction and hold two truths at once. Together they told him that poets ultimately translate celestial conversation into human feeling. He pressed them on the question of immortality, which seems urgent when one learns the scale of days. The sun spoke about cycles as a kind of immortality, a promise to come back that is not personal but communal. The moon, whose phases are smaller deaths and resurrections, said immortality is a pattern passed from parent to child, from story to story, not the stubborn persistence of one unflinching self. Night offered that immortality may be found in the way a gesture or phrase becomes part of a culture's night, a lullaby that keeps reverberating. They explained the architecture of gardens aligned to lunar and solar rhythms, where planting follows a luminous grammar. The sun advised planting by visibility and math, recommending days where light assures strong roots. The moon counseled planting by pleasure and intuition, advising crops that like the soft shadows and slow nights. Enoch saw that success in gardens, and in societies, comes from folding both approaches together. Enoch asked whether science and ritual had to disagree, and they smiled at him with the kind pity adults give the inexperienced. The sun saw science as disciplined light, making clear what was murky. The moon saw ritual as intentional shade, preserving wonder and allowing mystery to buoy meaning. Night observed that when they merge, people find both explanation and reverence, and life becomes richer for having both. They shared tales of sailors who trusted the moon more than charts, of farmers who harked to the sun's moods before hiring clockmakers. Enoch grew fond of the image of a captain reading the moon like a ledger and the sun like a calendar. He imagined how whole communities orient their lives by listening carefully to these changing voices and making decisions accordingly. He felt an ancient comfort in the notion that human life is not a solo but an ensemble with the heavens. The sun described festivals designed to honor it, days when the city emptied and altars went bright with oil and sacrifice, and people sang as if making a pact. The moon described nocturnes where music and sorrow braided into brilliant smallnesses, weddings lit with lamplight, mornings held with whispered names under a waning globe. Night described how these celebrations reflect communal priorities. Sometimes they uplift, sometimes they correct, but always they show how people insist on meaning in their fleeting hours. Enoch asked if the sun ever felt regret for so much exposure, for burning away secrets to deliver clarity. The sun admitted that endless clarity can be merciless and that sometimes it has scorched fragile things in the name of seeing. The moon offered that regret is the moon's currency. She collects it like shells and pays it out as soft consolation. Night, with her patient stoop, said that regret softens edges and is useful for learning. They walked him through the phenomenon of sundown protests and midnight vigils alike, where people choose specific hours to make statements because time gives acts their power. The sun acknowledged that daytime demonstrations carry a rhetorical logic: visibility is power. The moon said that nocturnal gatherings can be more intimate and resolute, sometimes accomplishing things that daylight cannot, because people speak differently under the shroud of stars. Night pointed out that timing is itself a rhetorical tool, a way of using the sky to amplify voice. Enoch asked about the ancient astronomers who were labeled both scientists and sorcerers, and they smiled at the category. The sun said those people were translators, turning motion into numbers and ritual into schedule. The moon called them poets of motion, people who listened to celestial breath and made maps. Night called them guardians, for in charting the skies they ensured that future generations could keep arguing with the sun and the moon. They told him how empires tried to command time by punishing those who disrupted schedules, and how, in response, small community acts persisted: midnight markets, dawn prayers, afternoon siestas. The sun recounted laws that attempted to make labor resonate with profit instead of human need. The moon explained the subversive pleasures of the night market where free exchange happened away from usual regulation. Night observed that laws that deny natural rhythm breed quiet resistance, and resistance cultivates secret calendar traditions. As days and nights continued their lessons, Enoch's own sleep patterns shifted. He found that learning the language of time meant waking at odd hours with questions. Sometimes he rose with the dawn to watch the sun's patient expulsion of stars, sensing names whispered as each color arrived. Other nights he stayed awake to watch the moon hold sway, seeing it as a slow sculptor, chiseling out private revelations from the dark. They taught him to watch the sky as an argument in progress, not as a finished text. Clouds are interlocutors, they said, who intervene and complicate the debate by changing color and pattern. Storms, the sun warned, are rhetorical collapses. They force all voices to pause and be reconsidered. The moon added that storms make the earth audible in strange ways, amplifying small sounds: an insect's cry, a child's sob, which the sun might miss in its glare. Enoch learned to listen to weather as a kind of editorial: sunshine underwrites, winds annotate, and thunder redraws. He began to track which hours made ideas more fertile and which hours hardened them into dogma. The sun favored action and clear light, bringing haste and ambition. The moon favored reflection, making people reconsider and sometimes forgive. Night counseled that a wise life alternates between both, alternating doing and thinking like the steady interchange of day and night. They showed him how to read shadow as a moral compass. The lengthening of a shadow, the tilt of a tree's shade before sundown, told of intentions and fatigue in the same way that posture tells of a person's mood. The moon said that shadow harbors secrets but also lends privacy. Sometimes protection requires darkness. The sun responded that revealing can be healing too. Many ills cannot be cured until they are brought into the light of common understanding. Enoch began to discover small rituals for himself, lighting a candle when the sky decided to be mean, stepping outside at certain hours to feel how different air stung or soothed the skin. The sun approved of rituals that encourage gratitude. The moon favored rituals that cultivate patience. Night advised him to keep these personal rites modest so they would not calcify into dogma, but precise enough to be effective. They taught him the geometry of shadows, how the angle of an obelisk at noon can measure far distances and tell a traveler about latitude and time. The sun was proud of these clear measures, and the moon admired the paradox that such certainty can coexist with the mysteries of the night. Night smiled at the human capacity to build instruments that translate light into knowledge. Enoch learned that every instrument is a conversation with the world. It asks and answers in the same breath. Enoch went into towns and saw how people made schedules as if they were weaving time into useful cloth. Markets opened at certain hours, prayers were timed to sunrise and sunset, and families kept birthdays by a private lunar count handed down through hushed counsel. The sun explained that this weaving is how communities conspire to make life survivable. The moon told him that those secret lunar markers are the heart's private drum, a beat people follow when public measures fail them. He learned of births under particular lunar shapes being considered auspicious or awkward, and saw how superstition and sincere observation braided into custom. Midwives consult stars and old wives adjust their palms according to moon phase, combining science and tradition. The sun conceded that when curious humans noticed patterns, they were sometimes right by accident, but the moon advocated for humility and the habit of noticing. Night claimed that noticing is the first act of wisdom. They talked about the language of color the sky keeps for itself, the crimson of dusk promising endings and the blue of noon promising productivity and clarity. Enoch learned to listen to these colors as cues, the sky's punctuation marks. The sun used color to signal business and courage, the moon used it to hint at mystery and longing. Night reminded him that color is feeling made visible. Enoch asked if there are mistakes made by day and night and how they reconcile them. The sun admitted to overreaching once when, in arrogance, it lingered too long over a field and burned tender shoots meant for regeneration. The moon confessed to withdrawing too firmly once, causing a village to fear what might have been made softer by small light. They said that reconciliation requires a return to balance and a confession to the people affected, a kind of cosmic contrition. They introduced him to the idea that time can be secreted like a treasure, depending on where you stand. For a shepherd alone on a hill, an afternoon can last like an entire season. For a man burdened with duty, mornings can evaporate like dew. The sun sympathized and said that perception often misleads us more than the heavens do. The moon insisted that some experiences are meant to be elongated, held, and honored rather than hurried. Enoch learned that some nights are contagious with awe. A clear night can infect a city with poetry, setting sparks in the hearts of strangers who then begin to speak in tender ways. The moon described the phenomenon as a tidal empathy, when beauty lifts certain hearts and they lift others in turn. The sun agreed and mentioned days of mass inspiration when entire populations act toward a common good just because the light felt kind. They told him about the craftsmen who make instruments to catch light, lenses, mirrors, glass, and the cunning of people who reflect the sun to cheat the night of its secrets. The sun felt flattered and wary of such tricks, while the moon found them clever and slightly mischievous. Night grinned and noted that reflections are always partial, always a reminder that reality can be multiplied and complicated but never wholly replaced by simulacra. Enoch discovered that time has a pedagogy. It teaches through repetition first, and then through interruption. The sun's pedagogy favored ritual and habit, building muscle memory, while the moon's pedagogy preferred surprise and variation, disrupting complacency. Night liaised between them, staging lessons precisely when neither felt authoritative. Enoch learned that the best education alternates routine and rupture. They spoke about the feeling of oldness, what it means to be ancient under lights that have watched for millennia. The sun suggested that oldness is a crown of accumulated mornings, each one a small lesson. The moon argued that oldness looks like many wanes and recoveries, like a life that has had time to learn the art of return. Night said oldness is the residue of many stories pooled at the bottom of a life, available for the young if they ask. Enoch began to see how cities can be attuned differently, some leaning toward daylight enterprise, others towards nocturnal creativity. He imagined a city where markets bloom at dawn, law courts open at sunrise, and theaters light at dusk. He also pictured a place where artisans kept late hours and coffee houses hum through the night, where invention prefers shadow. Day and night explained these differences as cultural choices with practical consequences. They taught him the dialect of seasons and how the solar angle makes seasons speak in different voices. In high summer the world shouted, in deep winter it whispered, spring sang in anticipations, and autumn hummed in goodbyes. The moon said seasons give rhythm to human metabolism and emotion alike, letting people rehearse hope and practice letting go. Night commented that the seasons are the planet's way of renewing its own vows to life. Enoch trained himself to mark the subtle shifts in color and scent that prefigure a change of weather, a new season, or a coming calamity. The sun rewarded such attention by granting clear mornings that made planning possible. The moon encouraged small checks, feeling the oak's leaves, tasting air for rain, to stay in touch with cyclic intelligence. Night celebrated this practical intimacy with the world. A mind at home in the weather is a mind at home in its destiny. They taught him about the small astronomies practiced by lovers and thieves alike, about coded schedules and secret rendezvous set by certain alignments. The sun scorned secrecy that harmed others but allowed clandestine kindness if it kept people safe. The moon, a fan of rumor and romance, endorsed codes that sustained secret communities. Night remarked that secrecy is a useful technology when used to protect the vulnerable and a weapon when used to hoard advantage. Enoch learned of monuments aligned to preserve a special moment, a stone aperture that frames the solstice's first light or a temple that lets the full moon sit in its heart for one night. The sun took pride in structures that caught his purity at exact instants. The moon loved places that cradled her gentle glow and encouraged people to meet there in trust. Night suggested these monuments are societal anchors, reminding communities of shared time and memory. They told him how words change meaning throughout a day. A promise in the morning carries a different tonality than a promise made in the deep night, and confessions at noon differ from those at twilight. The sun argued for the clarity of morning words, the moon favored the intimacy of nocturnal language. Night concluded that time's color language. To understand a speech fully one must know the hour and the mood in which it was spoken. Enoch asked about the end of the world, and the heavens were patient with him as a teacher is with a frightened pupil. The sun said cosmic endings are not singular explosions but often slow unwinding of patterns we once took for granted. The moon wondered whether the world ends when we cease telling its stories. Night comforted him, proposing that endings are transitions into forms we might not yet recognize. They shared with him practical skills for surviving ambiguous times, light-making techniques, ways to preserve food through seasons of scarcity, boats rigged for unpredictable tides. The sun showed which days are best for drying grain and which hours weaken disease agents. The moon taught methods for listening to the sea's mood. Night argued that practical wisdom is the only kind that can preserve hope through instability. Enoch felt his learning begin to shape him. His gestures gained a new deliberateness, each movement indicating a person in conversation with time. He started to greet mornings differently, thanking the sun with a gesture of acknowledgement he had invented for himself. He began to mark his nights with small acts of remembrance under the moon so that memory would not be lost in the rush of chores and obligation. They taught him the ethics of time, that urgency must be tempered by patience and that delay can sometimes be a moral stance. The sun emphasized responsibility and timely action. The moon warned of the cruelty of endless hurry, which tears at relationships and at the soul. Night insisted on mercy, recommending pauses that let decisions be reconsidered. Enoch wanted to pass this knowledge on, to build a school where people could learn the language of day and night. The sun supported instruction focused on discipline and measurement, teaching the young how to honor commitments. The moon advocated for apprenticeships steeped in listening and watching, where pupils learned patience. Night argued that any school of time must teach humility, that mastery is less important than fidelity to the rhythms of life. They gave him a final exercise, one that felt both cruel and generous, to spend a single year keeping a log of light and darkness, noting how decisions altered and were altered by hours. Enoch accepted and was surprised at the detail the task demanded, the way he began to notice the microshifts in public mood with the weather and how private acts resonated through months. The sun, moon, and night watched him as a gardener watching a seedling, understanding that education changes not just knowledge but the shape of a person. Over that year, he collected small miracles, a harvest saved by a timely storm, a reconciliation that occurred beneath a full moon, a child born at dawn whose laugh seemed to rearrange a household's sorrow. The sun marked the workdays with exactness, and Enoch learned to value punctuality. The moon marked the interior shifts, the moments when a person turned toward compassion, and Enoch learned to value the patient mathematics of the heart. The year taught him endurance, the capacity to hold questions without being answered, to act while accepting not all problems will be solved at once. The night taught him how to befriend uncertainty, how to sleep with questions tucked gently under a pillow so that dreams might work on them. The sun taught him how to use clarity when it was needed most, and how to cut through fog without cruelly exposing tender things. As his knowledge deepened, Enoch found a responsibility emerging that he could not have anticipated. He became a keeper of stories, a person to whom shepherds and midwives, sailors and poets brought their small confusions. He mediated disputes over timing and taught farmers to respect the moon's subtle advice about planting after certain rains. The sun and the moon both praised him quietly, like patrons who watch an apprentice find his way. People began to call him by a new name, Timesayer, Sky Listener, Keeper of Two Lights. He disliked titles but accepted them as tools people used for sorting their world. The sun told him to wear the name like armor bolstered by discipline, while the moon insisted it be worn like a shawl that could be taken off when one wanted privacy. Night advised a balance between public identity and private life, warning against the corrosion of worshiping one's own reputation. Enoch grew older and the texture of his memory shifted. His recollections tied themselves less to dates and more to gestures, to the small signals in light and shadow that had rearranged outcomes. He remembered the winter when the moon seemed particularly bright and the town's laughter lasted for 3 days. He recalled the summer when the sun held back rain and fields cracked, and how improvised wisdom saved the seed. These memories were not tidy, but they were true in the ways that mattered to survival. In his twilight years, he sat with apprentices and told them the thing the sun and moon had told him most insistently, that mastery of time is less about domination and more about listening. He instructed them to notice the small textures, a shadow's edge, a child's breath, the way elders' hands folded, because sensitivity is the skill that converts observation into care. They learned that time's dance asks us not to lead all the time but to take turns, to move when commanded by the world's rhythms and to offer steps when kindness is required. He taught them to celebrate mistakes, not to ignore them but to ritualize them so the community could learn. The sun praised this practice because it reduces hubris, allowing society to evolve patient, ethical schedules. The moon soothed those who feared ridicule, reminding them that the night unfolds many experiments. Night urged compassion for wrongdoers, that forgiving can be a method of teaching rather than acquitting. Enoch's final lessons were small and uncanny. Wake before the dawn sometimes and watch how the world is made anew, and go outside in certain nights just to hear the wind speak. He asked apprentices to keep a journal that would not be read by magistrates but by those who needed maps for private journeys. The sun advised discipline and note-taking, the moon advised discretion and sharing. Night requested mercy for all who try and fail. In the end, Enoch did not die as a scholar might imagine, with proclamations and tidy legends. He went quietly one night when the moon was a thin sliver and the town slept in scattered lights. People who loved him found a note where he had written a few sentences in careful hand about what mattered: attention, ritual, listening, and courage. The sun gave a bright morning so those left behind could see, and the moon kept the night soft, easing mourners with a slow, merciful gathering of stars. After he was gone, stories proliferated that Enoch had been taken up by angels of dawn and dusk, that he had become a small constellation, that the moon had knelt to him once. The sun smiled at such stories, liking the way they added shine to a life well lived. The moon preferred less pomp and more quiet retellings at kitchen tables where people leaned in to hear about how to plant by the right moon. His apprentices upheld his practices, teaching them in simple ways when to plant, how to console, how to keep calendars that honored both public duty and private revelation. Towns that had once been rigid with time softened a little, allowing siestas for the elderly and night markets for the poor. People took to greeting the dawn with brief acknowledgments and closing their shops for a little moonlit pause more often than before. And so the dance continued. Day and night kept speaking, sometimes arguing, sometimes co-conspiring, and humans kept listening, changing their lives in small increments. The world did not become perfect, nor did it end its contradictions, but there was a delicate improvement. People grew a little more practiced in distinctions between urgency and haste, between publicity and privacy, between work and care. Enoch's legacy was not grand architecture but a subtler thing, a culture of attention. Those who study the old stories say Enoch learned the deepest secret at the end, that the sun and the moon are not merely instruments of time but mirrors of human vocation. The sun reflects what must be done, the moon reveals what should be cared for. Night is the hand that stitches them together. Understanding this, people found their rhythms less strange and their lives more whole. The sun continues to rise, unswayed by the centuries, offering its blunt pedagogy of visibility, and the moon continues to arc in patient cycles, offering its softer lessons. Night remains the mediator, teaching the dignity of rest and the necessity of shadow. Enoch, a once curious man turned keeper, teaches us that to live well is to listen to them all and to act in a rhythm where duty and tenderness are balanced. If you ever find yourself on a dawn road or a midnight bridge, try what Enoch did: stand and listen, not for grand proclamations but for small instructions. Feel the sun's insistence on attention, notice the moon's persistence in memory, and leave room for night's quiet counsel. In these little rituals lives a secret. Time is not just a measure to be conquered but a dance to be learned, together. When Enoch first looked up, the sky felt like a vast book whose pages were turned by unseen hands. The sun burned its constant message across the day, and the moon answered with a silver script at night. He learned early that these two lights were not merely objects but teachers, carrying laws and stories folded into their motion. Their steady path across the heavens became a kind of grammar for living, a language that could be read if one learned to see rhythm and measure in the sky. He discovered that the sun spoke in certainty, in a straight line of purpose that warmed and unmangled. The moon spoke in return by showing how things changed, how light could withdraw and return. When he followed the sun, he felt the world crisp and delineated. Borders of shadow and blaze gave him good judgment of where to walk. When he followed the moon, he learned patience, the slow revealing of form, the way memory softens and deepens. Both together taught him a balance between decision and waiting, between clarity and mystery. Enoch's first lessons came at dawn, when the horizon spilled gold and the air tasted of possibility. The light then was a teacher that shouted lessons to the eyes and warmed the back of the neck like the hand of a parent. He memorized the way the air changed as the sun rose, the first cool breath then warming, and with it he felt a map for action. Rising time, he found, was sacred in the same way that telling the truth is sacred, both cut through fog and deception. Evenings offered different instruction. With dusk came a thinning of certainty that taught him how to hold questions rather than answers. The moon's ascent was slower, more deliberate, like a teacher arriving to class with arms full of stories. Enoch learned to listen in those hours when the hard edges of the day dissolved into gradations. The moon had patience for nuance and taught him how to hear the small things. He did not see the sky as empty. For him, the heavens were crowded with persons, archangels, watchers, luminaries, and the spirits of stars whose voices could be tuned to by prayer and attention. Some of them were fierce and unbending, other spirits gentle and secretive, and they all had mandates connected to the sun and the moon. Enoch's wandering opened doors between human sorrow and the language of the spheres. Each step atop a hill was a lesson in listening, each hill a pulpit for the sky to instruct him. The ancient texts he read or was shown by dream scholars spoke of the Book of the Luminaries and the Book of Watchers, which took the sun and the moon as central characters in a cosmic drama. These books explained not only mechanics but purpose, and they made room for the emotion of the heavens. The sun was given motion by a council, the moon by a court of ministers who regulated its phases and influence. Enoch learned names and offices, not to hoard knowledge but to understand the order beneath motion. He noticed cycles within cycles, daily, monthly, yearly, and beyond, an architecture of time that made human lives intelligible. The sun marched in a faithful circuit, calibrating seasons and the growth of grain, while the moon arced in a monthly ballet that murmured to tides and to hearts. Enoch began to treat time as something woven, where each thread affected the weave. When he learned to see how a single missed season could unbalance a village harvest, he knew that cosmic motions were not abstract but practical and moral. From the sun he learned the meaning of light as faith. Light pressed outward from the source and the world responded with revelation, crops responded by growing, and people responded by working. Light as faith insisted upon action, upon visible consequence, and the sun taught Enoch the ethics of responsibility. When one sees clearly, one cannot pretend ignorance. The sun forced moral clarity in the same way a judge's gavel forces truth. The moon taught a different ethics, the ethics of renewal and of concession. Where the sun wanted natural law to be known and obeyed, the moon showed mercy through cycles of return and forgiveness. It waxed and waned but always promised reunion, and that cyclical promise shaped a more forgiving kind of justice for Enoch. He learned that sometimes one must retreat, lose light for a moment, and in that retreat prepare for a more generous illumination. The watchers told him of secret windows in the sky where the sun and moon exchanged counsel. They described vaulted halls where light measured deeds and where shadows were examined for sins of the heart. Enoch listened and began to see shadows as testimony rather than merely absence. A shadow could reveal the shape of a soul as surely as light could reveal a face, and this was a new kind of seeing that he carried into his dealings. Enoch's travels took him to coastal places where the moon's pull could be felt in the tides as a literal hand upon the earth. Standing on the edge of salt water at night, he felt small and great at once, small because a single human body could not constrain the sea, great because the same moon ruling the oceans also influenced the rhythm of life in the tiniest cell. He saw fishermen reading the moon as one reads a ledger, calculating when to leave harbor and when to return. In their hands, lunar knowledge was practical, a book translated into practice. He learned the art of counting with a stone and a notch, developing a calendar that obliged the community to plant and harvest in concert with the heavens. Counting began as survival and grew into ritual, marking months with ceremonies that attached meaning to the passage of time. The sun and moon anchored those ceremonies, framing births, deaths, marriages, and vows. This was civic wisdom, a story told with communal rhythm, a governance of light and dark that stitched people together. Enoch also discovered a quieter, inner mapping where the sun and moon corresponded to parts of the human soul. The sun was the will, outward and decisive, the force that moves and makes promises. The moon was the memory and imagination, inward and reflective, responsible for dreams and the tides of feeling. He practiced aligning the two, training his will not to crush his imagination but to move with it, and his imagination not to wander without the guide of purpose. On nights when the moon was full, his dreams were sharp and saturated with color. The passage of the moon gave texture to his sleep. Some phases brought prophetic clarity, others oblique riddles. Enoch learned to read the moonlit dreams as if they were maps, tracing back to day times when choices had been made and forward to consequences unrolled. Prophecy for him became less about fortune-telling and more about understanding the way present acts set the compass of future days. There were seasons when the sun seemed too severe, scorching the fields and making hard things crack. Enoch understood this as a lesson in limits. Too much clarity can blind, too much heat can consume. The sun could be tyrant as well as teacher, and with that came a warning about absolute power. He watched how societies suffered when daylight ruled unquestioned, how intolerance could thrive under a sky that refused to temper itself. The moon offered its counterweight by teaching discretion, by encouraging concealment and revelation in measure. Its phases were a curriculum in secrecy, what to hold back, when to reveal, how to orchestrate gradual revelation so a people might change without fear. Enoch used this lesson to counsel leaders, advising restraint where force would create ruin. He argued that the most potent light is often the one that arrives slowly enough for the heart to ready itself. He learned songs attached to the celestial bodies, old hymns that were sung at thresholds of light. These songs were not mere devotion, they were mnemonic devices encoding timings, instructions, and moral injunctions. Through melody and meter, knowledge passed from elder to child in a shape that the mind could keep even when memory failed. Enoch himself became a carrier of songs and found that vocalizing made the sky's laws feel embodied and alive. The watchers taught about measurement and precise order, telling of heavenly wheels and appointed paths, and Enoch began to see how the sun and moon required calculation to be properly honored. Without measurement, ritual became superstition. Without accurate reckoning, a people could miss the sowing and starve. He studied angles and the length of shadows as if they were scripture, and he learned to translate those mathematics into human rhythms. These calculations created calendars that were at once technical and beloved, instruments for survival that also shaped culture and aesthetics. Festivals were born from necessary observation, and from those festivals came art and poetry. The sun's return at a particular turning became a feast, and the moon's brightening at another point became a lament turned to joy. So culture and cosmos braided together, each reinforcing the other with beauty and discipline. Enoch picked up tools of observation, a gnomon to study shadow, a bowl of water to watch the moon's reflection, and simple devices that turned daily observation into reliable knowledge. He taught others how to build them, knowing that technique democratized wisdom and prevented elites from hoarding power. When people across the valley could read the rise of the sun and the reaching of the moon, they gained agency. The sky ceased to be a domain of specialists and became a common book. The moon's phases became a metaphor he used with lovers and lawmakers alike, for nothing in human affairs was purely constant. A relationship could wax into warmth and wane into distance. A law could be clear in its founding and then require renewal. Enoch advised that patience was a duty when dealing with the waxing and waning of affection and consensus. That little lunar lesson made him a gentle counselor and a shrewd statesman. He encountered skeptics who mocked the celestial personification and insisted that sun and moon were mere stones and gas. Enoch listened and argued with them on practical terms. If the sun's motion produced harvests and the moon governed tides, then whether one called them spirits or physics mattered less than the consequences of their passage. Reason paled where practice still required respect, and he would sometimes stand with a farmer and check a planting date, showing that knowledge must reconcile spirit and utility. To him, the debate between myth and mechanism was a false dichotomy. Both lenses revealed parts of truth. Sometimes the sky itself seemed to speak contempt for such debates, offering eclipses where sun and moon collided and ordinary certainties dissolved. During those strange absences of light, people grew superstitious and fearful, telling of omens and new appointments of fate. Enoch, in those hours, carried calm like a lantern and explained that eclipses were not punishments but complex motions. He taught that crisis demanded explanation and presence, that to walk through a sudden darkness required hands and voices steady enough to be trusted. Eclipses taught him humility because they showed how fragile human explanations were under the large machinery of the cosmos. No calculation could wholly domesticate their mystery. Even the best astronomer would blink in surprise when day became night without warning. Enoch learned that humility in the face of wonder opened people to a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge that acknowledged limits while still insisting on responsibility. He practiced that humility, and it gave him strength. He learned names for colors he had never observed before: pale gold for first dawn, bruce purple for certain dusks, a blue so cold that it revised the senses, and he made language to match those subtleties. Naming was an act of intimacy with the sky, a way to claim small ownership of experience without claiming dominion. The act of naming taught others to take notice. People began to speak finer and finer about what they saw, and in that detail lived a more attentive life. As he taught, Enoch found that myths were living instructions disguised as story. The old tale that the sun was the charioteer and the moon the wise child was not merely embroidery, it encoded a relational ethic. The sun as charioteer meant accountability for motion, for steering the day toward harvest and justice. The moon as child meant vulnerability and receptivity. When leaders internalized that metaphor, they bowed to both duty and tenderness. He wrote down what he could, but much of his wisdom was oral, performed in evenings around the fire. Stories became a pedagogy of embodied memory, and Enoch shaped narratives so listeners could move from hearing into action. He used small parables about hands and light to teach about governance and about the gentle law of tides to explain mercy. People who left his night circles walked differently the next morning, as if their steps had been aligned to a larger beat. One story he told frequently involved a village that tried to hold the sun captive, building screens and mirrors to command its light at will. For a season the village prospered in appearances, but then the land, forced into unnatural rhythm, began to fail. The lesson was plain: respect the natural order. The sun could not be imprisoned for human convenience without a reckoning in the soil and in the bodies who tilled it. In another tale he told of a moon that lost its cycle and forgot to pull the tide. The sea, bereft of its compass, thrashed and took more than it should. The villagers who had cheated the moon were taught the costs of hubris. Not every line of power is for human manipulation. These stories were warnings and invitations, warnings against arrogance, invitations to partnership with the cosmos. The tone was never didactic alone, it was warm counsel as well. Enoch spent nights in the company of hermits who had learned subtle arts of attunement with lunar light. They practiced small rituals and quiet watchings, and he learned that such disciplines honed attention. These were not superstitious trinkets but daily exercises like breath and posture, practical ways to refine senses so a person could see the precise edge of a shadow. With these skills, decisions could be made with less error, with less waste. The sun, on its part, had monks who rose with it and practiced truth-telling and labor in open air. They treated honesty as a sunlighted duty, a thing to be carried into market and field alike. Enoch admired their clarity because it cleaned rotten institutions. When merchants told true weight, markets thrived. The sun's ethic was about transparency, fair exchange, and the visible weight of promise. Over time, Enoch came to think of the sky as a library of temperaments where every shape of light cultivated a virtue. Dawn cultivated courage to begin. Midday cultivated endurance and the capacity for sustained work. Dusk cultivated reflection, and midnight cultivated deep listening. The moon cultivated cyclical repair and imagination. To live well was to rotate with these temperaments, letting each hour inform appropriate behavior. He also explored darker metaphors where the moon could be cunning or the sun indifferent, and he knew that celestial virtues could be perverted in human hands. A tyrant who spoke of sunlight and truth might wield those words to cloak cruelty, while a deceitful lover might masquerade as the moon's soft comfort to manipulate. Enoch's job was to teach discernment, to help people see not only the metaphors but their embodiment in human actions. He saw that wisdom is not merely knowledge of theory but the skillful application of moral vision. Enoch's own life was not untouched by mistakes. There were lovers who left him, agricultural experiments that failed, and friends who misunderstood his counsel. The sun and moon held him accountable, not by punishing directly but by showing natural consequences, failed crops, restless nights, seasons of community distrust. He used those failures as teaching tools publicly and privately, modeling how to repent, repair, and realign with the larger rhythm. He argued that ritual matters because human beings are creatures of repetition and habit needs forms to channel it toward virtue. The sun and moon offered natural rituals, rising to work, sleeping under the moon, marking months, that formed the scaffolding for good habits. He fashioned communal rites around these natural markers, ceremonies that made moral practices durable. People who observed them slept better, fed their children in time, and held marriages that could weather drought. Enoch spent a long winter in a mountain monastery where the days were short and the moon felt close, a great glossy coin in a polished sky. There he learned the art of interior fasting, which was less about hunger and more about narrowing attention. With less light at his disposal, he practiced concentration, training his mind like a lens to hold a single brightness. That discipline taught him that the sun and moon also required inner economies. Sometimes the soul must be spared excess to remember what is essential. In that monastery he met an astronomer priest who explained, in gentle language, the rhythms of the heavens in ways that married wonder with mechanism. The priest used simple metaphors to translate arcane angles into human terms, showing how the tilt of the earth made seasons and how the moon's pull calculated tides. Enoch found that the more he understood the how, the more sacred the why felt. Science and myth were not enemies but companions, telling two parts of a single story. They drew charts on wooden tablets and spoke of longer cycles beyond human memory, of ages when suns were said to rise and fall for whole generations. The priest showed Enoch how to trace a comet's path and how eclipses could be predicted. With this craft, fear diminished and curiosity flowered into responsibility. Forecasting tired times and abundant times allowed communities to plan and preserve. Knowledge became an act of stewardship rather than ownership. Enoch sometimes traveled into valleys where traders were masters of the moon's commerce, using lunar cycles to mark credit and debt. These merchants had a sophisticated ethic. Credit was a promise to the future light and debt was accounted under the phases. He learned from them the cruelty of unmeasured lending and the wisdom of mutual accountability. Economic life, shaped by celestial cycles, became humane when tempered by lunar pity and solar probity. In the presence of kings, Enoch would speak of governance as an alignment job. A ruler must be like the sun in steadfastness and like the moon in humility. He told princes that a kingdom is an orbit, an arrangement that succeeds when forces are balanced and fails when one pulls too strongly. He encouraged rulers to host councils, to listen like the moon and decide like the sun, balancing mercy with clear law. Those who followed him found better governance and fewer uprisings born of neglect. There were moments when Enoch's voice trembled, when even his practiced steadiness could not tame the enormity of what he had seen. He would then retreat to stones and water, to small acts like pressing a palm to cool earth and feeling the pulse beneath. The earth itself became a teacher, showing reserves and limits, and he came to cherish ground-level reality as the place where sky's laws met living flesh. That contact kept his ideals from floating into abstraction. He meditated on names of light given in ancient tongues and discovered that words themselves carry a gravity. Some names made him feel light, open, and capacious, others closed him like a fist. He realized that in learning sky names people learn sanctity, because naming is a form of covenant. One acknowledges a thing and is bound in relation to it. This taught him reverence for vocabulary. The way one calls a thing matters as much as the way one treats it. As he aged, Enoch found that the sun's commands became softer, no less steady but tempered by experience. He had begun life with a zeal for imposition that left little room for other people's pace, but the moon's patience had worn him into gentleness. He learned the art of invitation rather than command, of coaxing new habits through modeling and small encouragements. The villagers who had once bristled at his strictness came to trust his quieter wisdom. He collected small relics of sky wisdom, a dried blade of grass taken at sunrise, a cup of well water left out to catch moonlight, a polished pebble from a tidal line. These objects were not fetishes but tactile anchors for teaching, reminders that theory must be translated into lived practice. Holding them, people could remember promises and ceremonies, and these reminders were powerful in moments of choice. Little rituals like this kept bodies and communities aligned with the planet's motion. Enoch was sometimes accused of being too poetic by strict clerics who preferred rigid doctrine to embodied practice. He responded by teaching that poetry and ritual scaffolded ethics in ways plain rules could not. A law read aloud will change a heart in a way that a line read in silence rarely does. He saw poetry as a vehicle of habit, a method by which truth could be rehearsed until it became second nature. He wrote no grand doctrine but many small instructions, sentences like seeds to be planted across generations. He advised mothers on timing of breastfeeding with lunar rhythms, advised bakers on sunrise kneading for bread that fermented with sun-tempered patience, and advised soldiers to march in step with day and rest in step with night. His counsel touched mundane and monumental matters alike, always returning to the principle that aligning with the sun and moon was aligning with life itself. Traveling far, Enoch found diverse cultures interpreting the same lights in many languages, each creating different ritual ornaments around the same basic motions. Some peoples endowed the sun with aggressive virtues, others made the moon their primary teacher, and yet all found ways to weave the lights into social life. These variations enriched his understanding. The cosmos was a shared grammar but allowed dialects. He came to cherish pluralism as a robust response to shared reality. In these journeys he encountered those who claimed to control time through artifice, who manufactured calendars that favored narrow interests. Enoch could detect when calendars were weaponized, when months were lengthened or shortened to profit plutocrats. He stood against such manipulations because they broke trust with celestial order and community. For him, time kept fair when it reflected natural rhythms rather than private advantage. On one pilgrimage to a seaside temple, he listened to an old keeper recite the long names of lunar phases in a near-forgotten tongue. The keeper spoke as if each syllable pulled a piece of the tide, as if sound itself could regulate water. Enoch felt the force of language again, how liturgy could be tidal and how memory could be anchored by phonetic shapes. The recitation was practical again, teaching sailors when to set sail and farmers when to sow. He also studied the moral psychology of brightness and darkness, noting how people react to prolonged daylight or harsh winter darkness. Those raised under long summer days often developed a confidence and a tendency toward outward action, while those reared in long winters cultivated inward depth and storytelling. Enoch used such anthropological insight to advise cities in how to structure communal life around their local light rhythms. Institutions built with awareness of such temperaments tended to be more resilient. Enoch's dialogues with archangels were intimate and yet practical. Gabriel instructed him on proclamation, Raphael on healing rhythms, and Uriel on the mathematics of light. These angels did not exist merely as metaphors. In his experience, they were active counselors who translated cosmic motion into human prescriptions. He felt their presence as guidance rather than command, and that nuanced difference was central to his teaching. There were moments of ecstatic vision when the orbit felt transparent and Enoch could see a pattern of cause and effect unrolled like a great map. In those visions he saw how small human acts could reverberate across seasons, how a neglected rule could ripple into famine, and how a single act of mercy could mend a social seam. Those visions strengthened his conviction that the sun and moon were not only physical fixtures but moral engines. To act in time with them was to act for the well-being of future generations. He encountered poets who turned the sun and moon into lovers, fooling the world into thinking romantic metaphors were all that mattered. Enoch respected such aesthetic renderings because metaphor moves the heart toward truth, yet he always returned to the practical roots of his art. Love between celestial bodies is stirring, but the more pressing love is that which guides a child into safety and a nation into steadiness. He held hearts and institutions together, understanding that public ethics and private affection require the same attention. There were disputes about which light to honor first. Some communities put the moon at the center of calendars, others the sun. Enoch never insisted on a single answer. He emphasized the necessity of coherence. A society that set its ceremonies in a consistent place on the calendar grew trust and ritual memory, and that unity mattered more than theoretical primacy. He taught that order is a property of faithful repetition rather than mere doctrine. Enoch delineated a practice for crisis, when the sun seemed to overdo its work with drought or when the moon's influence seemed to rupture social life. Gather people to the center and speak plainly. Bring in watchers and elders, scientists and poets, draw the map of observed changes, and consent to adapt rituals in the light of new knowledge. He insisted on deliberation that was spirited but slow enough to welcome the moon's counsel. The ritual of collective attunement rarely failed to restore balance. He kept a private book filled with marginalia, small descriptions, notations of a particular day's light, a sketch of a shadow at noon, and a moonlit dream transcribed at dawn. That book was his laboratory and his confessional. He wrote to remember and to refine. Each marginalia became fodder for teaching the next year. The book was humble but capacious, a manual for living by light. In caring for community, he found that leadership is less about commanding the orbit and more about steadying those within it. He compared a good leader to a planet that holds a moon, providing a gravitational center but also room for unique motion. Leaders must provide enough stability to hold the people's rhythm but not clamp their agency. Under such governors, societies learn to bend without breaking. The analogy extended into family life where parents could be suns or moons. Some modeled steady illumination and clear boundaries, others modeled patience and cyclical forgiveness. Enoch advised combining both, encouraging households to be systems of both clarity and mercy. Children raised under such combined governance showed a capacity for honest action and resilient repair. The family thus reflected the cosmos not only in metaphor but in function. As he grew older, Enoch noticed the human body itself obeyed solar and lunar laws. Sleeplessness rose in times of innate stress as if the body had lost track, and pastoral attention to sleeping rhythms remedied much. He advocated for social routines that respected the body's natural cycles, work in daylight, rest at night, knowing that human physiology was a caretaking partner in communal longevity. Sometimes the gentlest reforms, aligning work to daylight, healed social ailments faster than legal decrees. He also encountered skeptics who weaponized science against ritual, arguing that ritual was manipulation. Enoch answered them by pointing to the therapeutic effects of ritual and the neurological reinforcement it provided. Ritual, when honest, is a technology of meaning. It stabilizes memory and moral action through embodied practice, and science, he argued, supports rather than negates that function. The sun and moon taught him an ethic of hospitality. The sun encouraged openness to strangers across the day when travelers passed through, while the moon encouraged quiet watchfulness for those who arrived at night. Enoch insisted that a humane society must be hospitable at all hours, with institutions designed to care for wayfarers in both light and dark. Hospitality, he argued, is a culture's practice of cosmological alignment. Host and guest are both accounted for by rhythms of welcome. He wrote songs for children about the sun's steady drum and the moon's hush. Children learned the beat of work and rest through games, the simple rhythm embedding civic sense in a playful way. Education, for him, was early attunement rather than early instruction. He asserted that a well-tuned childhood is the best defense against later dissonance. Enoch sometimes used architecture to teach celestial truths, aligning doorways with sunrise, building windows to frame the moon at certain nights. Such architecture made doctrine visible, a way to practice alignment without quoting books. When people move through such spaces, they are rehearsing cosmic habits. Houses and temples became teachers in their own right. One lesson that returned often was about listening to complaint, which he called the moon's verdict. Complaints were like tides, they revealed pressure points and imbalances. A community that silenced complaint was effectively damming a wound. Enoch argued for forums where voices could be aired and reconciled under the moon's governance of the hidden and the wounded. He developed medical practices informed by light. For instance, for certain illnesses he prescribed exposure to morning light to stimulate appetite, and for certain melancholies he prescribed evening gatherings under the moon to rarefy grief into story. Light therapy in his hands was not mystical but pragmatic, an ancient wisdom anticipating modern discovery. He combined herbs and rhythm, believing the body and cosmos were co-therapists. Enoch's journeys eventually took him to deserts where the sun's power was brutal and the moon's reprieve thin. There he learned the discipline of moderation and the sanctity of shade. Shade became an ethic in architecture, a recognition that even the sun's spoils must be mediated. The desert taught him that abundance and scarcity required different kinds of wisdom. In the mountains he learned a different tempo, thin air, long shadows, and a moon that seemed to chase the sun in cleaner arcs. These places taught him altitude of thought, how perspective alters policy. The higher one goes, the more one sees of cycles and the less one fears immediate turbulence. Those lessons improved his role as a mediator because he could translate brief local crises into longer arc, preventing panic. He taught sailors songs to count stars and track the moon, not to romanticize the night but to keep people safe. Navigation by celestial bodies is a discipline of precision and humility. Miscounting can be fatal. Enoch insisted on teaching the clearly practical along with the poetic, believing both to be necessary for human survival and flourishing. The sailor who sang his songs arrived home to tell the tale. Enoch remained fascinated by the interplay of light and memory, how certain phases of the moon invoked ancestral recollection in ways that the sun could not. An old widow, when the moon hit a certain angle, would remember her husband's laugh with fresh clarity. The moon, in this way, acted as a living archive. Enoch asked communities to honor those recollections ceremonially because memory is the backbone of ethics and communal identity. An old controversy he faced repeatedly had to do with prophecy. Some claimed that the moon whispered future events into the ears of the chosen, others said the sun revealed immutable destiny. Enoch tempered both. Prophecy could be real but was often a reading of patterns rather than a script. He encouraged humility and verification, teaching that prophetic claims needed social accountability, if only to protect communities from false certainty. He explored the relation between star positions and human temperament, learning that patterns of the wider sky, not just sun and moon, influenced myth and practice. Constellations served as mnemonic scaffolds for everything from navigation to moral exemplars. Enoch appreciated that the whole heavens were a text, not a single paragraph. Sun and moon were the most legible lines, but not the only lines. The wider cosmos invited imagination about what justice looked like across distances. Enoch's own death, when it came, was framed in his tradition as a release into orbit. People told stories of him ascending like a comet to a place where he could still attend dawns and listen to moons. Whether myth or mystery, his legacy persisted in the rituals he helped refine and the habits he taught. His life had shown that aligning with the sun and moon was less about celestial mastery and more about moral attunement. After his passing, communities kept his counsel alive not as text alone but through continued practice, calendars that respected both light and dark, festivals that balanced exuberant clarity with gentle melancholy, and councils that convened at phases that invited the right temperament. His songs persisted, hummed by bakers, sailors, and mothers who rose at sunrise to feed children. In that way his voice continued to orbit the lives he had taught. Generations argued and adapted, but a through line remained. People who anchored their lives to the steady motion of the sun and moon tended to flourish in ways that were practical and soulful. They cultivated resilience in crops and tenderness in law, and they practiced a politics that weighed bright action against slow repair. Enoch's imprint, diffused yet persistent, shaped civic life where the sky was a constant partner. New discoveries continued to transform understanding. Instruments improved, charts were refined, and the old watcher's language acquired explanatory power that would have astonished earlier generations. Still, the fundamentals remained: light and dark organize life, cycles demand respect, and naming and ritual create memory. Enoch's method, blend story with calculation, prayer with measurement, humility with action, remained an enduring template for communities seeking to steward their world. Teachers and schools took to telling children about Enoch's patient methods, how he taught observation, how he urged care for the slow and the urgent, and how he positioned the sun and moon as tutors rather than tyrants. Curriculum that included such stories trained citizens who could read the sky and interpret time ethically. The practice of intergenerational teaching, a hallmark of Enoch's work, became the backbone of cultural continuity. Artisans used Enoch's sayings as motifs, carving suns and moons into bread ovens, bell towers, and ships, making cosmology a matter of craft. Craftspeople taught apprentices not only techniques but the rituals of timing, when to fire the kiln, when to raise the sails. The interplay of skill and season made production itself an ethical act, crafting not only goods but social order. Community healers adapted lunar cycles into childbirth practices, recognizing the way the moon could influence labor and mood. They created spaces where birth and mourning were held in attentive timing to light cycles, offering both practical scheduling and symbolic repair. Enoch's insistence on aligning bodily life with cosmic ebb and flow kept these practices humane and compassionate. Births were safer and mourning more communal. Debates about the role of technology and artificial light became increasingly urgent, and Enoch's voice in those debates was characteristically balanced. He welcomed innovation that improved lives, but warned against technologies that severed people from natural rhythms. Artificial light that prolonged the day for profit often undermined sleep and health, and he argued for deliberate policies that protected night. He taught that freedom includes constraints that preserve the commons. There were scholars who tried to create monographs on Enoch's thought, trying to extract clean doctrines from a life lived in practice rather than in lectures. Enoch's method resisted such extraction. His wisdom was local and adaptable. To codify it too tightly would make it brittle. Yet his core teaching, attunement to cycles, humility before patterns, courage to act, could be distilled into practice without freezing it. He watched, as the centuries turned, the sun remain steady and the moon continue its patient rounds, holding the world in a mechanical sympathy. People forgot and remembered him in cycles, just as the moon waxed and waned. Where his name was absent, his practices often persisted, because routines are conservative creatures. Enoch became both a person and a tendency embedded in the ways people organized their days. Stories grew around him, some likely true and others embroidered beyond recognition, but even the embellishments taught something beneficial. Awe at the sky can be a civic virtue. These stories provided a kind of moral architecture that the practical teachings needed so that they would be internalized, not merely followed. Folklore preserved the low-level intuition that one must keep time with the sun and moon or else risk losing something essential. In the end, Enoch's central argument remained simple: live in time with the planet, and you honor both survival and beauty. The sun and moon will teach you about the cost of haste and the gift of return, about the necessity of steady labor and the grace of rest. To orbit morally is to practice both decisive action and patient repair, letting light and shadow together create a human world that is sustainable. Aligning with the eternal orbit was, for Enoch, the most practical spirituality there is. Those listening to his songs centuries later, in quiet hours or while driving on a modern road under electric lights, could still feel something subtle. The advice felt neither archaic nor fussy: rise when the day invites work, rest when the night asks for attention, steward the earth and one another with tenderness and firmness. The cadence of his counsel translated easily into contemporary life, because the sun and moon remain constants in a century of flux. Beyond doctrine, Enoch showed how to build a rhythm into the smallest domestic decisions: time dinner to dusk, read aloud when the moon is full, plant seeds in accord with the coming sun. Such habits softened the friction between public policy and private life, creating a culture where civic rhythms and home rhythms were not at odds. It mattered that these same rituals were shared, for shared rituals knit trust and make cooperation feasible. Musicians still set his aphorisms to melody, creating communal songs for sowing and for storm. Music lodged his ideas into bodies, and bodies thus acted without argument. When a harvest party rose to a song born of Enoch's counsel, there was a kind of governance in the singing. The social law was enacted in the motion of dance as much as in minutes of counsel. That embodied enactment proved durable across centuries. Enoch's practice also included an ethic of remembrance for lost lights, those who died prematurely, those whose names faded from official memory yet whose small acts kept the community alive. He taught commemorative rituals during certain lunar phases, when remembering was not melancholic but restorative. Memory, for him, was a resource. It repaired social fabric by keeping small debts acknowledged. At certain times, communities would perform a calm of eclipse ritual where they would make vows not to act rashly, pledging to consult widely when the unexpected struck. Enoch had taught them that eclipses expose the parts of a society that are brittle. During such rituals, leaders committed to consult the slow minds and the poets, to allow the moon's counsel of restraint to temper the sun's impulse to fix things quickly. These pauses prevented policy disasters. He also prepared for catastrophic change by teaching the art of redundancy, seed banks, shared water stores, calendars hedged against miscalculation. The sun and moon showed him that natural cycles sometimes fail, and prudence was to expect and plan for those failures. Redundancy was not pessimism, it was care for the weak points of one's social organism. Those preparations saved lives and lean years, and gratitude for their saving kept them in place. Enoch's movement never sought to dominate other ways of understanding, it simply insisted on a mode of life that formed people to be attentive and generous. He believed that moral formation takes time, and the sun and moon provide a temporal architecture by which such formation is possible. Societies that grow up under those architectures develop a kind of durable empathy that resists fads. It is a slow education into civic kindness. He refused cultish secrecy about his methods, teaching openly and encouraging shared authorship of calendars and songs. He believed wisdom multiplies when shared, and he feared the corruption that secrecy breeds. Transparency about celestial counting and ritual practice kept communities resilient and egalitarian. His insistence on openness helped contain abuses that often follow monopoly over timekeeping. Across epochs, thinkers borrowed his metaphors to frame debates about justice, economics, and care. Enoch's blend of myth and measurement gave them a vocabulary that was at once evocative and practical. Rhetoricians found that his images could cut through sterile argument, bringing listeners back to embodied common sense. That rhetorical utility kept his teachings in circulation beyond their original cultural contexts. Enoch's practice of pairing the sun's clarity with the moon's compassion turned up in laws that prioritized both accountability and mercy. Judges who studied his methods learned to weigh facts against the human context, to mete out punishment that repaired rather than destroyed. This juridical practice worked better in communities that had daily habits of care and honesty. Law became a living practice rather than an instrument of domination. Even technology adapted to his sensibilities. Architects designed windows to reduce glare and preserve night sky stargazing, and cities regulated light pollution to promote rest. Streets were planned to encourage safe travel at night rather than overwhelm the dark. The modern reinterpretation of his ethos turned out to be a conversation between ancient rhythm and modern invention, showing that wise constraints complement progress. Parents taught their children how to watch for small signs of change in both crops and relationships, training the gaze to read the sky and the household simultaneously. Children learned early to respect the authority of the day for work and the night for healing. Those taught in such a way carried those practices into adulthood as second nature. Such socialization created continuity of care. Enoch's model of leadership as orbit keeper spread into other spheres. Nonprofits modeled their calendars on sun and moon lessons, farmers' cooperatives used lunar cycles with modern soil tests, and therapists used light-based routines as part of treatment. His influence proved adaptable because it was formulated as practice rather than dogma. That pragmatic universality helped his teachings move across cultures and centuries. As seasons spun and nations rose and fell, small communities clung to the rhythms he had taught as anchors against instability. When empires collapsed, it was often local rhythms, daily prayers, markets timed to sunrise, collective bread baking at dusk, that held communities together. The practical wisdom of timekeeping preserved social memory when institutions failed. Enoch had taught the value of what endures beneath political change. In times of moral panic, the moon's counsel was often sought to remind people to slow down. Enoch's liturgies included midnight vigils where voices were lowered and only vital concerns were discussed. Those vigils had the practical effect of preventing rash legislation and of allowing tempers to cool. The moon's temperance provided a cultural safety valve. He was skeptical of idolization but insistent on ritualization. Idolization freezes and excludes. Ritualization creates a repeated space for renewal. Enoch's community practiced the latter, rituals that allowed for public apology, for the healing of grievances, and for the reestablishment of trust. Ritual becomes a social technology for repair, and he taught its mechanics as carefully as he taught sun angles. Enoch's legacy was thus less a closed system and more a toolkit, a way of reading the sky and translating it into social practice that could be adapted to new circumstances. Communities who used the toolkit thrived, while those who abandoned it suffered from erratic governance and exhausted social bonds. The lesson was pragmatic and moral at once. Civilization requires attention to rhythm. Even in the modern era of artificial time and fluorescent light, people returning to Enoch's patterns found benefits in mental health, agricultural productivity, and civic cohesion. He offered a simple challenge: align your institutions with the natural flow of day and night and the monthly returns of the moon and see what steadiness you gain. It is not a cure-all, but a foundation upon which humane institutions are built. Enoch taught that small habitual alignments compound into societal resilience. More than anything else, Enoch taught the art of attention, how to look, when to speak, how to count shadows, and how to keep a promise. The sun demanded the promise be kept, the moon allowed for the slow work of repair. To listen to both is to be both responsible and humane. Enoch's teaching was practical and spiritual at once because it married action with repair. Listening to his stories is to rehearse a life of measured motion, begin at dawn, work with the light, rest under moonlight, and meet hardships with preparation and humility. These habits turned out to be conservative in the best sense, conserving soil and relationships, memory and trust. Enoch's orbit was an ethics of cadence, a moral metronome set by the heavens. As you drive beneath an evening sky or watch the moon curve above a city of electric glow, consider that these ancient rhythms still bear lessons. They asked for small adjustments to modern life: earlier bedtimes for children, careful light regulation at night, community festivals that mark real seasonal change. Those changes are not aesthetic only, they are the repair of our social nervous system. Enoch's story ends without a tidy finality because it is not a single life but a practice that endures. The sun keeps rising, the moon keeps circling, and human beings continue to test how well they can live in time with them. That shared choreography is the secret he passed on. A life tuned to the eternal orbit produces both beauty and endurance. Wherever people live like that, the community carries the imprint of his wisdom. Enoch's wisdom still lives wherever people move in rhythm with the world. Subscribe and tell us in the comments if you feel more inspired by the peace of living in harmony or by the strength it takes to keep that balance.